The first thing Elias felt was pain, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to radiate from every bone in his body. He opened his eyes to a sterile white ceiling, the scent of antiseptic and healing herbs thick in the air. Sunlight filtered through high, arched windows, casting long shadows across the infirmary beds. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if weighed down by chains he couldn't see. "Awake at last," a voice said, dry and uninterested. A healer in white robes approached, her expression bored as she checked a chart. "You took quite a beating in the courtyard. Some of the older students thought it'd be fun to test your durability." She snorted. "F-rank mages shouldn't wander alone during break time, boy. Consider it a lesson." Elias didn't respond. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fragmented images. He remembered fleeing, from a group of laughing faces, their hands glowing with crude elemental magic. A fireball had singed his shoulder, an ice shard grazed his cheek, and then darkness. But beneath those recent memories, something older stirred. Visions of a throne carved from obsidian, legions of dark creatures kneeling before him, and a final, searing light that tore through his very soul. He sat up slowly, wincing as the movement sent fresh jolts of pain through his ribs. Looking down at his hands, he saw pale, slender fingers, nothing like the clawed, powerful hands he remembered. This body was weak, magically stunted. He could feel the faint flicker of mana within him, but it was like a dying ember compared to the inferno he once commanded. "Who am I?" he whispered, the question more for himself than the healer. "Elias Thorne," the healer said, not looking up from her chart. 17 years old, admitted to the Arcane Academy 6 months ago. Magical aptitude, F rank. Current status, pathetic. She finally met his eyes, her gaze devoid of sympathy. "Get dressed. You have a magic assessment in an hour. Headmaster's orders, they want to see if that beating knocked any sense into you." As she walked away, Elias closed his eyes again. The name Elias felt foreign, a label slapped onto a vessel that didn't fit. But the other name, it rose from the depths of his mind like a beast from the abyss. Zogaroth. The Demon King. The one who had nearly shattered the world millennia ago, only to fall to a coalition of heroes and gods. He remembered the betrayal, the final spell that scattered his essence across time and space. And now, he was here, reborn into this frail, mocked existence. The legacy of annihilation stirred within him. It wasn't a physical power or a cheat skill, it was the weight of millennia of knowledge, battle strategies, arcane secrets, and the intimate understanding of apocalyptic magic. He could feel it all, locked away in his soul, a library of destruction that made the modern magic of this era seem like child's scribbles. But his body was a prison. He couldn't access that power, not yet. All he had was the cognitive gap, the ability to see what others couldn't. He dressed in the simple gray robes of a low-ranking student, the fabric rough against his skin. As he left the infirmary, he walked through the grand halls of the Arcane Academy. Marble floors echoed with the footsteps of students, their chatter filling the air. He saw groups practicing spells in courtyards, their movements clumsy and inefficient. A boy trying to summon a water orb fumbled the incantation, the spell collapsing into a puddle. Elias almost corrected him instinctively, the third syllable was mispronounced, causing a mana leak, but he bit his tongue. Drawing attention now would be suicide. The magic assessment was held in the Grand Hall, a vast chamber with stained glass windows depicting legendary mages of old. At the front stood a stone podium where teachers in ornate robes waited, their expressions stern. Students lined up, buzzing with nervous energy. Elias took his place at the back, his head down. He could feel the stares, the whispers. "Look, it's the F-rank trash," someone sneered. "Heard he got beaten so bad he forgot his own name." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Elias ignored it, focusing on the podium. The assessment was simple, each student would step forward, channel their mana into a crystal orb, and perform a basic spell. The orb would glow with a color corresponding to their rank, red for F, orange for E, up to violet for S. Elias had done this before, 6 months ago. The orb had flickered a weak, sickly red, and the laughter had been deafening. As the line moved forward, Elias watched. A girl summoned a gust of wind that barely ruffled the papers on the podium E-rank. A boy created a small flame in his palm, D rank. The teachers nodded, making notes. It was all so primitive. Elias's mind raced with improvements. The wind spell wasted mana on unnecessary gestures, the fire spell's heat distribution was uneven, risking backlash. He could teach them in minutes, but he stayed silent. Then, she appeared. Arya Flameheart, the Academy's top fire mage, walked to the podium with a confidence that seemed to part the crowd. She had crimson hair tied back in a practical braid, eyes the color of smoldering embers, and a presence that commanded attention. Even the teachers straightened up, watching her with respect. Elias's breath caught in his throat. As she placed her hands on the crystal orb, it blazed with a brilliant, deep orange A rank, bordering on S. The hall erupted in applause. But Elias wasn't looking at the orb. He was looking at her soul. Through the legacy of annihilation, he saw past the surface. The way she held herself, the subtle tilt of her head, the fire that danced in her eyes, it was all so familiar. Memories flooded back, a battlefield under a blood-red sky, a general in dark armor wreathed in hellfire, kneeling before him and swearing loyalty unto death. Ignis. His most loyal fire general, who had stood by him until the very end. And now she was here, reborn as Arya, a celebrated student who didn't remember him at all. The irony was a knife twisting in his gut. He wanted to step forward, to call out her name, to demand she remember. But he saw the way she glanced at the other students, kind, but distant. A hero in training, praised for her power. To her, he was just another face in the crowd, another weakling to pity. Next. Elias Thorne, a teacher, barked, snapping Elias back to the present. He walked forward, his steps slow. The whispers grew louder. This should be good, someone chuckled. Elias reached the podium, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the strain of holding back the storm of memories. He placed his palms on the cold crystal orb, feeling its latent magic humming. He channeled his mana, the feeble trickle he possessed. The orb flickered, a weak, sputtering red. It didn't even glow steadily, it pulsed like a dying heartbeat. F rank, the teacher announced, his voice dripping with disdain. No improvement. Next. Elias stepped back, his head bowed. The laughter was expected, but it still stung, not because of the mockery, but because of the sheer absurdity. Here he was, Zogaroth, the demon king who had once wielded magic that could unmake stars, reduced to this. As he turned to leave, he caught Arya's eye. She was watching him, a faint frown on her face. Not malice, but pity. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, it's okay. But it wasn't okay. In that moment, Elias's mind was a tempest. He saw the flaws in her fire magic, the way she overchanneled, risking burnout, the lack of control in her finer manipulations. She was powerful, but untrained in the true arts of destruction. And she was his general, whether she knew it or not. He couldn't reveal himself, not with the Academy's eyes on him. But he could guide her, subtly. He could protect her from the mistakes that could get her killed. As he walked out of the grand hall, the label F rank trash echoing behind him, Elias made a decision. He would hide. He would play the weak, bullied student. He would use his knowledge to steer his generals Arya, and whoever else he found away from the flawed teachings of this era. And when the time came, when real threats emerged, they would see. They would all see. The chapter ended with Elias standing alone in a deserted corridor, the shadows lengthening around him. He looked at his hands again, the weak flesh that housed a king's soul. A storm brewed in his mind of past glories, present humiliation, and a future only he could foresee. Arya's pitying glance lingered in his memory, a spark in the darkness. He smiled, a cold, grim expression. Let them laugh. The Demon King was awake, and his lessons were just beginning. The morning bell echoed through the stone corridors of the Arcane Academy with a metallic clang that set Elias's teeth on edge. He stood outside the combat training hall, his student robes, marked with the shameful gray F-rank insignia on the left breast, hanging loosely on his slender frame. Around him, students flowed like a river of colorful silks in confident chatter, their ranks denoted by vibrant hues, crimson for A rank, gold for B, sapphire for C, emerald for D, and his own dull gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A group of D-rank students passed by, their laughter sharp and pointed. "Look, it's the infirmary ghost," one sneered, a boy with spiky blue hair and a wand tucked behind his ear. "Thought you'd still be crying in bed after yesterday's assessment." Elias didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, sifting through millennia of memories that felt both distant and immediate. The legacy of Annihilation hummed in his soul, not as a physical power, but as a vast library of arcane knowledge, battle strategies, and intimate understandings of magic's fundamental laws. To these children, magic was a tool to be learned. To him, it was a language he had spoken before their ancestors drew breath. He pushed open the heavy oak doors to the training hall. The space was vast, with high vaulted ceilings supported by stone pillars carved with runes that glowed faintly with protective enchantments. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows depicting heroic battles against mythical beasts, ironic, given that he recognized some of those monsters as former allies from his empire. Sand-covered floors stretched toward a weapons rack at the far end, where practice swords, staves, and shields gleamed under magical lights. At the center of the hall stood Instructor Borin, a burly man with a beard like tangled wire and arms thick as tree trunks. His voice boomed across the room. "Line up by rank. Today we drill basic sword forms. No magic, I want to see your raw technique. The foundation of combat isn't flashy spells, it's how you hold your blade." Elias took his place at the very back of the line, behind even the D-ranks. His body felt alien, weak muscles, shallow breaths, a heartbeat that fluttered like a trapped bird. This vessel was a far cry from Zogaroth's demonic form, which had once towered over battlefields, wielding shadows and hellfire. Now, he was Elias, the Academy's punching bag. His eyes scanned the room, and they landed on Kale. The star swordsman stood at the front of the A-rank line, his posture straight and confident. He wore light leather armor over his crimson robes, a practice sword resting easily on his shoulder. Sunlight caught the sharp angles of his face, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds. To everyone else, Kale was the prodigy, the student who had won last year's tournament with a dazzling display of speed and precision. But Elias saw something else. Memories surged. Vorax, his dark general of the Iron Legion, standing before the throne in the Obsidian Citadel. The same set of the shoulders, the way he shifted his weight slightly to the left before striking, the subtle tension in his wrists that spoke of countless battles. Vorax had been a master of brutal, efficient swordplay, his techniques honed in the demon wars. Now, reborn as Kale, he moved with a polished grace that was flawed. Elias's analytical mind dissected every motion as Kale demonstrated the first form, a simple overhead slash. The students mimicked him, their movements clumsy or over-exaggerated. Kale's own slash was fluid, but Elias spotted the imperfections. His front foot was placed an inch too far forward, unbalancing his center of gravity. His grip on the hilt was too tight, limiting wrist flexibility, and he exhaled at the wrong moment, wasting breath that should have been conserved for follow-up strikes. These were minor errors, but in a life-or-death fight against a true threat, they would be fatal. The modern teachings had smoothed the edges of Vorax's raw power into something aesthetically pleasing but structurally weak. Elias felt a pang of frustration, not for himself, but for this shadow of his general. He had led these souls through apocalypses, now, they were being taught to fail. "Pair up!" Instructor Borin barked. A ranks with B ranks, C with D F rank. He paused, his gaze settling on Elias with disdain. "You, boy. Solo drills. I don't want you dragging down anyone's progress." Snickers rippled through the hall. Elias merely nodded, picking up a practice sword from the rack. The wood felt light and flimsy in his hands, a toy compared to the soul-forged blades of his era. He began the basic forms, his movements slow and deliberate. Outwardly, he looked like any other struggling student. Inwardly, he was running simulations. If he adjusted his stance by 3 degrees, shifted his weight distribution, he could generate twice the force with half the effort. But he held back, letting his body perform the clumsy motions expected of an F rank. His attention never left Kale, who was paired with a B rank girl. They sparred lightly, Kale effortlessly deflecting her attacks. Each time he moved, Elias catalogued another flaw, an overextension here, a missed opportunity to counter there. It was like watching a master painter copy a child's drawing. During a break, the students gathered around a water fountain. Elias lingered at the edge, sipping from a canteen. Kale stood nearby, wiping sweat from his brow, surrounded by admirers. "Your footwork was amazing, Kale," a C-rank boy gushed. Kale smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks. Still feels off, though. Like I'm missing something." Elias saw his opening. He moved closer, pretending to stumble over a loose tile. As he righted himself, he spoke softly, his voice barely above a murmur. "Your center is too high. Drop your hips and widen your stance by a hand's breadth. It'll fix the torque in your swings." Silence fell. Kale turned, his storm gray eyes narrowing. The students around them stared at Elias as if he'd spoken in tongues. "What did you say?" Kale's tone was neutral, but there was an edge to it. Elias met his gaze, keeping his expression blank. "Your form. When you slash, your hips are too elevated. It creates a weak pivot point. Lower them, and you'll generate more power from the ground up." He pointed vaguely toward Kale's feet. "And your stance is too narrow. It limits lateral movement." A burst of laughter came from the blue-haired D-rank boy. "Listen to the trash. Giving advice to an A-rank? Maybe you should focus on not dropping your own sword, Elias." But Kale didn't laugh. He studied Elias, a crease forming between his brows. Without a word, he walked back to the training area and assumed his stance. He adjusted his feet, sinking his hips slightly. Then he executed the overhead slash again. The difference was subtle but immediate. The sword cut through the air with a cleaner sound, his body flowing into the motion with less resistance. Kale froze, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. "See? Luck," the D-rank boy scoffed. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." Kale ignored him. He looked back at Elias, who had already returned to his solo drills, feigning concentration on his own clumsy movements. "How did you know that?" Kale asked, his voice low. Elias shrugged, keeping his eyes on his sword. "I read it somewhere. An old combat manual in the library." It was a lie, of course. The knowledge came from drilling Vorax on these very techniques 10,000 years ago, on blood-soaked training grounds under a red sun. Kale's expression shifted, confusion, then a flicker of something deeper. A strange familiarity, like a half-remembered dream. He opened his mouth to say more, but Instructor Boren's voice cut through the hall. "Enough chatter. Back to drills. And you, F-rank, stop distracting your betters." The rest of the class passed in a blur of repetitive motions. Elias continued his act, but his mind was racing. Seeing Kale up close had confirmed it. His generals were here, their souls reborn, but their memories were buried under layers of this new life. And they were being taught wrong. The Academy's methods were adequate for petty duels and ranked exams, but they would shatter against the kind of threats Elias knew still lurked in the world's shadows. As the bell signaled the end of class, Instructor Boren clapped his hands for attention. "Listen up. Next week, we're starting the first-year dungeon expedition. You'll be grouped into teams of 4, mixed ranks. It's a controlled environment, low-level monsters, basic traps. A chance to apply what you've learned in a real scenario." Excitement buzzed through the students. Dungeon expeditions were a rite of passage, a taste of adventure. But Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. His senses, attuned by the legacy of Annihilation, prickled. The word dungeon triggered a cascade of memories, ancient prisons, sealed catacombs, places where dark things had been buried and forgotten. And this Academy's dungeon, he had felt its presence since he awoke, a faint, discordant hum beneath the school's foundations. Something was down there. Something that didn't belong in this era of controlled environments. As the students filed out, chattering about team compositions and potential loot, Elias hung back. He watched Kale walk away, the swordsman pausing once to glance back, his eyes lingering on Elias with that same unsettled curiosity. Alone in the emptying hall, Elias approached a window that overlooked the Academy's central courtyard. Below, students laughed and practiced spells, their magic sparkling like harmless fireworks. But his gaze was drawn to a distant, fortified entrance on the east side, the dungeon's gate, guarded by 2 stone golems that stood motionless in the afternoon light. A whisper of dark energy brushed against his consciousness, so faint that no one else would notice. It felt old, hungry, and familiar in a way that made the remnants of Zogaroth's soul stir with recognition. He placed a hand against the cold glass, his reflection pale and thin. "What have they been keeping locked up here?" he murmured to himself. The chapter ends with Elias standing there, the sunlight fading as clouds gathered overhead. Inside him, the legacy of Annihilation whispered warnings of seals grown brittle with age, of presences that should have stayed forgotten. The dungeon expedition wasn't just a school exercise, it was a door, and he alone sensed the thing waiting on the other side. The Arcane Academy's training dungeon lay beneath the eastern wing, a labyrinth of stone corridors carved centuries ago by earth mages. Torches flickered with enchanted flames along the walls, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to breathe with the damp, cool air. Elias stood at the rear of the group of 20 students, his worn academy robes hanging loosely on his thin frame. Around him, chatter and nervous laughter echoed off the rough-hewn walls. Most of the students were C-ranks and B-ranks, excited for their first real dungeon expedition. He felt their glances, the subtle shifts away from him, as if his F-rank status were contagious. Instructor Borin, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, led the way, his voice booming through the passage. "Stay alert. These tunnels are warded with basic containment seals, but monsters can still slip through. Stick to the designated path, no wandering off." Elias's eyes scanned the surroundings, not with fear, but with a detached, analytical gaze. The magic seals etched into the stone at intervals glowed with a soft blue light, simple glyphs of binding and warning. To the others, they were marvels of modern arcane engineering. To him, they were crude scratches, like children's drawings compared to the intricate, soul-bound wards of his era. He could see the flaws at a glance. The mana flow was inefficient, the symbols lacked the layered redundancies that would have made them truly secure. A faint smile touched his lips, barely a twitch, as he recalled the catacombs beneath his dark fortress, where seals could hold eldritch horrors for millennia. His attention shifted to the students ahead. Arya walked near the front, her crimson hair tied back, hands already glowing with a faint heat. She moved with a confident stride, but Elias noted the tension in her shoulders, a telltale sign of overcompensation, as if she were forcing her power rather than flowing with it. Kale was beside her, his sword drawn, eyes sharp as he scanned the shadows. His stance was better than in class, thanks to Elias's subtle correction, but still flawed. His weight was too forward, leaving his left side vulnerable to a quick strike. Elias felt a pang of something like nostalgia, watching these fragments of his once mighty generals reduced to stumbling through basic drills. "Keep moving," Borin called, as the group entered a wider chamber. Stalactites dripped from the ceiling, the sound echoing like distant whispers. In the center, a cluster of low-level slimes oozed across the floor, their gelatinous bodies shimmering with weak magical energy. A few students stepped forward, eager to prove themselves. Firebolts and ice shards flew, splattering the slimes into puddles that slowly reformed. Laughter followed. This was easy, almost playful. Elias hung back, leaning against a cold stone wall. He let his mind drift, tapping into the legacy of Annihilation. Millennia of battle experience surged beneath the surface, a vast ocean of knowledge that made this dungeon feel like a child's playground. He could have cleared it in minutes with a thought, but that would draw attention he couldn't afford. Instead, he observed, cataloging every detail, the mana density in the air, the faint tremors in the earth, the subtle decay in the seals farther down the tunnel. Something was off, a resonance that didn't belong. As the group pressed deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier. The torches seemed to burn dimmer, and the cheerful chatter died down to hushed murmurs. They reached a junction where 3 corridors branched off, each marked with faded runes. Borin paused, consulting a map. "We'll take the left path, it's cleared for training. But stay sharp. Dungeons can shift." Elias's senses prickled. The left corridor felt wrong, like a note out of tune. He could see the magic seals here were older, more degraded, and something had been gnawing at them from the other side. Not just slimes, something with teeth and malice. He considered speaking up, but bit his tongue. An F-rank warning would be ignored, or worse, mocked. So he stayed silent, his body tense with readiness. The corridor narrowed, the walls closing in until they could only walk two abreast. The air grew cold, and a faint, metallic scent wafted from ahead. Then, a low growl echoed, vibrating through the stone. Students froze, weapons raised. From the shadows, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared, followed by a hulking form. It was a mutated cave bear, twice the size of a normal one, its fur matted with dark, crystalline growths that pulsed with corrupted mana. Saliva dripped from jagged teeth, and its muscles bulged with unnatural strength. Boring cursed. This shouldn't be here. Fall back, defensive formation. Chaos erupted. Arya stepped forward, hands blazing. Firewall, she shouted, conjuring a barrier of flames between the bear and the group. But the creature charged through, the crystals on its skin absorbing the heat. It swiped at her, and she barely dodged, stumbling back with a gasp. Kale lunged, his sword striking the bear's side, but it glanced off the crystalline hide with a spark. The bear roared, turning on him, its claws tearing through the air. Elias watched from the rear, his mind racing. This wasn't just a mutation, it was a corruption, likely from a leak in the dungeon's ancient wards. The crystals were a sign of mana poisoning, something he'd seen in wars long past. Arya and Kale fought valiantly, but their techniques were all wrong. Arya's flames were too scattered, wasting energy, while Kale's strikes lacked the precision to hit the weak points between the crystals. They were struggling, and others were panicking, spells flying wild. The bear slammed Kale against the wall, the impact echoing with a sickening thud. Kale grunted, pain flashing across his face, but he pushed back, his sword trembling. Arya tried to encase the bear in a ring of fire, but it broke through, its eyes fixed on her. Elias knew he had to act subtly. If this continued, someone would get seriously hurt, and he couldn't let that happen to his generals, even if they didn't remember him. He edged closer, keeping to the shadows. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, forming words in a tongue dead for ages, the ancient demonic language of command. It wasn't a spell of raw power, but one of unraveling, a whisper that targeted the corrupted mana binding the bear's form. His voice was so low it was lost in the din, but the incantation wove through the air like a ghostly thread. Krothval Zundrak, he murmured, focusing his will. The legacy of Annihilation supplied the knowledge, this corruption was weak to dissonance, a counter-frequency that would disrupt its stability. The bear faltered mid-swing, its crystalline growths flickering. Arya seized the opening, blasting it with a concentrated jet of flame, while Kale drove his sword into a gap in the armor. The creature let out a final, guttural cry and collapsed, dissolving into a pool of dark sludge and shimmering dust. Silence fell, broken only by heavy breathing. Bryn rushed forward, checking on the students. "Is everyone all right? Arya? Kale?" Arya nodded, wiping sweat from her brow, her flames dying down. "I'm fine. What was that thing?" "A mana mutation, rare, but dangerous," Borin said, though his eyes were wary. "Good work, both of you. Now, let's regroup and head back. This expedition is over." As the students began to gather, murmuring in relief, Elias stayed back, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the risk he'd taken. He'd used a fragment of his old power, and though no one had seen him speak, the residual energy lingered, a faint, dark shimmer in the air that only a sensitive mage might detect. And there was one among them who would. Lyra, the Academy's top healer, had been at the rear, tending to a minor scratch on another student. Now, she stood still, her gentle blue eyes narrowed. She approached the fallen bear's remains, kneeling to examine the sludge. Her healing magic, attuned to life forces, brushed against the residue of Elias's incantation. She flinched, as if touching something cold and alien. Her head turned slowly, her gaze locking onto Elias. He met her eyes, keeping his expression blank, but inside, his mind raced. Lyra had been his general of restoration, Nyla, in the past, her soul still carried echoes of that connection. Her magic was sensitive to imbalances, and she'd felt the dark whisper he'd unleashed. She rose, walking toward him through the dispersing group. The others were too busy talking or packing up to notice. Stopping before him, Lyra's voice was soft but edged with suspicion. Elias, right? The F rank from the infirmary. He nodded, forcing a slight, nervous smile. Yes. That was intense. It was, she said, her eyes not leaving his face. I felt something strange in the magic residue, a dissonance, almost like an ancient command. Did you do anything during the fight? Elias's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. Me? I was just hiding in the back. You saw me, I'm not much help in a fight. Lyra tilted her head, her healing senses subtly reaching out. She didn't probe deeply, but enough to feel the surface of his soul, a vast, dark ocean beneath a calm facade. A headache sparked behind her temples, and she winced, flashes of imagery flickering in her mind, a dark throne, shadowy figures kneeling, a voice of absolute authority. She shook her head, stepping back slightly. Maybe. But that spell work, it felt old. Forbidden, even. Where did you learn something like that? Around them, the group was starting to move out, Boren herding them toward the exit. Elias held Lyra's gaze, his mind working furiously. He couldn't reveal the truth, not here, not now. But he couldn't lie too blatantly, her intuition was too sharp. I read a lot of old books, he said, keeping his tone light. Sometimes, you pick things up. Lucky guess, I suppose. Lyra didn't look convinced. The headache was fading, but the unease remained, a knot in her stomach. She opened her mouth to press further, but Boren's voice cut in. Lyra! Elias! Move it, we're leaving! She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. We'll talk later, she said quietly, before turning to follow the others. Elias watched her go, a chill settling in his bones. The dungeon expedition was over, but the real danger was just beginning. Lyra's suspicion was a spark that could ignite everything. As he trailed behind the group, the torchlight casting long shadows, he replayed the moment in his mind. The whisper, the bear's fall, Lyra's probing gaze. He'd avoided exposure for now, but the cliff's edge was closer than ever. And deep in the dungeon, the dark presence he'd sensed earlier seemed to stir, as if awakened by his touch. The Arcane Academy's dormitory corridors were never truly silent, even after curfew. Magic hummed in the walls, a low, persistent thrum of energy that Elias, once the demon king Zogaroth, found both fascinating and pitifully weak. He stood by the window of his sparse room, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard below. The events of the dungeon expedition earlier that day replayed in his mind, the mutated cave bear, Aria's frantic firebolts, Kale's clumsy swordwork, and his own whispered incantation, a fragment of the old tongue that had slipped out almost instinctively. He hadn't meant to draw attention. In his millennia of existence, subtlety had been a weapon sharper than any blade. But the bear's corruption had reeked of something familiar, a taint that reminded him of the darker corners of his former empire. A single word, Crothnall, had been enough to unravel its enhanced vitality. It was child's play for someone who had once commanded legions with a gesture, yet here, in this body of an F-rank student, it was a risk that could unravel everything. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Elias didn't need to open it to know who stood on the other side. He could feel the gentle pulse of healing magic, a light, soothing energy that was uniquely Lyra's. In his past life, she had been Seraphina, his most trusted healer and strategist, whose powers could mend flesh and shatter souls with equal ease. Now, she was just Lyra, the Academy's top healer, with no memory of the throne she once knelt before. Elias? Are you awake? Her voice was hesitant, laced with a tension that hadn't been there before. He took a deep breath, schooling his features into the weary, defeated expression that had become his mask. Come in. The door creaked open, and Lyra stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. She wore a simple night robe, her blonde hair tied back, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room as if expecting to find evidence of some dark secret. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air. Elias remained by the window, his back to her, feigning preoccupation with the view. We need to talk, Lyra said, her tone firm but not unkind. About what happened in the dungeon. Elias turned slowly, letting his shoulders slump. The bear? That was scary. I'm glad Arya and Kale handled it. Don't play dumb, Elias. Lyra took a step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I felt it. When the bear fell, there was a residue of magic, dark, ancient magic. And it came from you. He widened his eyes, injecting a note of confusion into his voice. From me? Lyra, I'm F rank. I can barely light a candle without my magic fizzling out. You saw me in class yesterday, I failed the basic levitation test. I know what I felt, she insisted, her gaze unwavering. It was a whisper, something under your breath. And when I tried to scan you with my healing senses afterward, to see if you were hurt, I got flashes. A headache so sharp it felt like my skull was splitting, and images, a dark throne, shadows moving like living things. Elias felt a flicker of alarm. Lyra's healing magic had always been attuned to the soul, even in this weakened state. It seemed some part of her recognized the echo of Zogaroth within him. He had to tread carefully. One misstep, and she might piece together enough to become a threat. I don't know what to tell you, he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Maybe you're overworked? Healing all those minor scrapes in the dungeon must have taken a lot out of you. This isn't fatigue, Elias. Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper, and she moved closer, until they were only a few feet apart. The scent of herbs and clean linen clung to her, a far cry from the incense and ozone that had filled his old halls. I've studied forbidden magic in the Academy archives. What I felt from you, it matches descriptions of demonic incantations. The old tongue, they call it. How could you possibly know that? Elias met her eyes, allowing a hint of defiance to surface. I read a lot. Old books, forgotten texts. My family had a small library before they died. Maybe I picked something up from there. It was a weak excuse, and he knew it. But sometimes, the simplest lies were the hardest to disprove. Lyra studied him, her brow furrowed. He could see the conflict in her expression, the healer's compassion warring with the scholar's suspicion. Show me, she said suddenly. Say the word you whispered in the dungeon. Elias almost laughed. Did she truly think he would be so foolish? I don't remember it. It was just nonsense, a lucky guess. I was panicking, Lyra. The bear was huge, and I thought we were all going to die. Lucky guesses don't unravel magical enhancements, Lyra countered, but her certainty was wavering. She raised a hand, her fingers glowing with a soft, golden light. Let me scan you again. Properly this time. If you're innocent, you have nothing to hide. Elias's instincts screamed at him to refuse, to push her away. But that would only confirm her suspicions. Instead, he nodded slowly, forcing himself to relax. Okay. If it'll make you feel better. Lyra placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. The healing magic flowed into him, warm and probing. It was an intimate sensation, one that would have been unthinkable in his past life, a mere subject daring to touch the Demon King. But now, he was Elias, the weakling, and he had to endure it. At first, there was nothing. Lyra's magic brushed against the surface of his soul, finding only the flickering, unstable energy of an F-rank mage. But then, it dipped deeper, touching the hidden layers where the legacy of Annihilation lay dormant. Elias felt it like a key turning in a lock he had tried to seal. Lyra gasped, her eyes flying open. The golden light around her hand flared, then sputtered. A sharp pain lanced through her temple, and she staggered back, clutching her head. What is that?" she breathed, her voice trembling. Elias reached out as if to steady her, but she flinched away. "Lyra? Are you okay?" "I saw it again," she whispered, her face pale. The throne, but clearer this time. And a figure sitting on it, shrouded in shadow, with eyes like burning coals. And a voice, calling my name. Not Lyra. Another name. She looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "Who are you, really?" Elias kept his voice gentle, masking the cold calculation beneath. "I'm Elias. Just a student who's in over his head. Maybe your magic is picking up on something else? Residual energy from the dungeon? That bear was corrupted, after all." It was a plausible diversion, and he saw her grasp at it. Lyra took a deep breath, straightening her robe. Maybe, she conceded, but the doubt still lingered in her eyes. But I'm going to look into this, Elias. Forbidden magic isn't something to take lightly. If you're dabbling in things you shouldn't. I'm not, he said, injecting as much sincerity as he could muster. I promise. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the distant chime of the Academy's clock tower marking the hour. Finally, Lyra nodded, though it seemed more out of exhaustion than conviction. We'll talk later. Get some rest. She turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. Elias waited until her footsteps faded down the corridor before letting out a slow breath. That had been too close. Lyra's instincts were sharper than he'd anticipated. If she continued to probe, if she shared her suspicions with Arya or Kale. He pushed the thought aside. For now, he had bought time. But he needed to be more careful. The legacy of Annihilation was a double-edged sword. It gave him knowledge beyond this era's understanding, but every use risked exposure. Asterisk. Meanwhile, in the headmaster's tower, Valerius sat before a large, crystalline screen that glowed with soft blue light. The security footage from the dungeon played in slow motion, captured by enchanted stones embedded in the walls. He was a tall, stern man with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, his robes adorned with the sigils of a master archmage. On the screen, the students moved through the dungeon corridors, their actions crisp and clear. Valerius watched as the mutated cave bear emerged, its form twisted by dark energy. He saw Arya's firebolts splash harmlessly against its hide, Kale's sword strikes deflected by unnatural resilience. And then, his gaze sharpened on Elias, who stood at the back of the group, seemingly cowering. But Valerius had spent centuries studying magic in all its forms. He saw the subtle movement of Elias's lips, the almost imperceptible whisper that carried no sound on the recording but left a faint distortion in the magical field. He paused the footage, zooming in on Elias's face. The boy's expression was one of fear, but his eyes were calm, calculating, as if he were analyzing the bear's weaknesses rather than running from them. Interesting, Valerius murmured to himself. He rewound the clip, watching it again. And again. Each time, that whisper stood out, a ripple in the mana that shouldn't exist from an F-rank student. He tapped a rune on his desk, and the screen displayed an analysis of the magical residue detected at that moment. It was faint, nearly buried under the chaos of the fight, but it was there, a signature of ancient, demonic energy. Valerius leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He had heard the reports from the dungeon, Lyra's concerns about dark magic, the bear's sudden weakness. At the time, he'd dismissed it as paranoia or a fluke. But this was evidence. He called up Elias's student file. It was sparse, almost suspiciously so. Orphaned at a young age, minimal magical aptitude, admitted to the academy on a charity scholarship. No records of prior training, no family history of note. Yet, this boy had just unraveled a corrupted beast with a whisper. Valerius's mind raced. The Arcane Academy was built on the ruins of an older world, one that had been shattered by the demon king Zogaroth millennia ago. He had dedicated his life to studying that era, and he knew the signs of its magic. What he saw in Elias, it was too precise to be accidental. He activated a communication rune, and the image of a stern-faced woman in scholar's robes appeared. Headmaster? Archivist Liana, Valerius said, his voice low and serious. I need a full background check on a student. Elias, from the first-year class. F rank. I want everything: birth records, family history, any unusual incidents before his enrollment. And cross-reference it with the historical archives. Look for anomalies. Liana's eyebrows rose. Anomalies, sir? In an F rank? Just do it, Valerius said, his gaze returning to the frozen image of Elias on the screen. And keep it quiet. I have a feeling there's more to this boy than meets the eye. As the communication rune faded, Valerius stared at Elias's face, his expression unreadable. The academy was a place of learning and light, but shadows had a way of creeping in. And if Elias was one of those shadows, well, Valerius would be ready. He had survived too long to let secrets fester unchecked. Outside, the moon dipped below the horizon, casting the academy into deeper darkness. In his room, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could feel the weight of scrutiny settling over him, a familiar sensation from a time when empires had trembled at his name. But now, he was just a student, weak and vulnerable. And somewhere in the depths of the headmaster's tower, a file began to grow, its pages waiting to be filled with truths that could shatter the fragile peace of the Arcane Academy. The morning sun filtered through the arched windows of the Arcane Academy's remedial magic classroom, casting long shadows across the worn stone floor. Elias sat at the back of the room, his posture deliberately slouched to match the expectations of an F-rank student. The air smelled of old parchment and ozone, the lingering scent of countless failed spells. Around him, a dozen other students shuffled in, their expressions ranging from boredom to shame. This was where the academy sent its magical failures, the ones who couldn't muster even a basic spark. Professor Thaddeus Grimshaw stood at the front, a tall man with a perpetually pinched face and robes that seemed to swallow the light. His reputation preceded him, a master of defensive magic who took particular pleasure in humiliating the weak. Elias had heard the whispers how Grimshaw had once reduced a student to tears for mispronouncing a simple incantation. Today's lesson, according to the chalkboard scrawl, was barrier spells, foundations and failures. Welcome, disappointments, Grimshaw began, his voice like gravel grinding against stone. Today, we will attempt to teach you what should have been learned in your first year. I have low expectations, so do try to exceed them. He gestured to a complex ward glowing in the center of the room, a shimmering dome of interlocking runes that pulsed with pale blue light. This is a standard academy-grade barrier ward. It is, in my estimation, the simplest form of protection a mage can master. Yet I suspect most of you will struggle to even comprehend its structure. Elias observed the ward with detached interest. To his eyes, trained through the legacy of Annihilation, it was a crude construct, a child's scribble compared to the apocalyptic fortifications he had once commanded. The runes were misaligned by a fraction of a degree, creating weak points where energy leaked. The foundational matrix was based on outdated principles that had been debunked millennia ago. He felt a flicker of annoyance, not at the ward's simplicity, but at the arrogance of presenting it as a masterpiece. Now, Grimshaw continued, each of you will approach and attempt to reinforce the ward. I want to see if you can identify its weakest point and shore it up. Begin with you, Elias. He pointed a bony finger, his lips curling into a smirk. Let's see if the Academy's most notorious failure can manage even this. Murmurs rippled through the room. Elias stood slowly, keeping his movements sluggish. He could feel the eyes on him, pity from some, mockery from others. As he walked toward the ward, he noted the subtle tremors in the magical field. The flaw wasn't just in the design, it was in the execution. The caster had overcompensated in the upper quadrant, creating a stress fracture that would shatter under sustained pressure. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering inches from the glowing surface. In his mind, he traced the flow of energy, mapping it against memories of siege warfare and dimensional breaches. The solution was obvious: redirect the excess from the upper runes to reinforce the lower lattice. But to do so openly would raise questions he couldn't answer. Instead, he decided on a different approach, one that would expose the flaw without revealing his true knowledge. Well, Grimshaw snapped. Are you going to stare at it all day, or do you actually intend to try? Elias took a breath, then placed his palm flat against the ward. He didn't channel magic, his body's reserves were too pitiful for that. Instead, he applied pressure at a precise point, using the barest trickle of energy to disrupt the matrix's balance. The ward flickered, the blue light dimming. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, it collapsed inward, dissolving into motes of light that faded to nothing. The room fell silent. Grimshaw's face went pale, then flushed crimson. What did you do? He hissed, striding forward. That ward was my design. It took me years to perfect. He loomed over Elias, his breath smelling of bitter tea. Explain yourself, boy. Elias met his gaze, keeping his own expression carefully blank. The ward was flawed, Professor, he said, his voice calm. The runic alignment in the upper quadrant created a harmonic dissonance with the foundational matrix. Under stress, it would have failed catastrophically. He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon. I merely demonstrated the weakness. Flawed? Grimshaw's voice rose to a shout. You dare criticize my work? An F-rank, magically inert waste of space? He grabbed Elias by the collar, his knuckles white. Do you have any idea what you've done? That ward was meant to be unbreakable. But beneath the anger, Elias saw a flicker of terror in the professor's eyes. The man had staked his reputation on this ward, and now it lay in ruins at the feet of a student everyone considered trash. Elias didn't struggle. He simply waited, his mind already analyzing the fallout. This was a risk. Drawing attention was dangerous with Valerius already suspicious. But sometimes, the direct approach was necessary. The flaw is in the third rune, he said quietly, so only Grimshaw could hear. You based it on Arcanist Veldrin's treatise, but Veldrin revised his theories 2 centuries after that text was published. The resonance frequency is off by 0.3 Hz. Over time, it destabilizes the entire structure. Grimshaw released him, stumbling back as if struck. How could you possibly know that? He whispered. Veldrin's revisions are restricted to master-level archives. Even I only learned of them last year. His eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with disbelief. Who are you really? I read a lot, Elias said, shrugging. It was a weak excuse, but it was all he had. He could see the gears turning in Grimshaw's mind, the fear that his life's work was built on a mistake, and the unsettling realization that the weakest student in the academy had spotted it in seconds. The rest of the lesson passed in a tense haze. Grimshaw dismissed the class early, his pride too wounded to continue. As the students filed out, Elias lingered, pretending to gather his things. He could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, others resentful. But one pair of eyes held a different emotion, concern. Arya waited for him outside the classroom, leaning against the corridor wall with her arms crossed. Her crimson hair seemed to catch the sunlight, and her expression was a mix of pity and frustration. Elias, she said as he approached. That was impressive. And stupid. He stopped, meeting her gaze. Up close, he could see the faint glow of embers in her irises, a remnant of her past as Ignis, general of the Infernal Legions. But now, she was just Arya, the top fire mage who saw him as a charity case. It needed to be done, he replied. That ward would have gotten someone killed. She shook her head. Maybe. But now Grimshaw will have it out for you. And with Headmaster Valerius already watching. She trailed off, then sighed. Look, I know you don't want help, but let me tutor you. Properly. Not out of pity, but because you clearly have potential. You just need guidance. Elias almost smiled. The irony was thick enough to taste. Here was Ignis, once his most loyal commander, offering to teach him magic. If only she knew. Thank you, Arya, he said, keeping his tone neutral. But you should focus on your own training. Your fire control is flawed. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. Excuse me? You overchannel, Elias said, his voice dropping. You treat your flames like a torrent to be unleashed, but fire is a living thing. It needs balance. You're forcing it, and it's fighting back. Look at your hands. Arya glanced down. Her fingertips were faintly reddened, a sign of minor burns she'd been ignoring. How did you? She began, but Elias cut her off. I've seen it before, he said, which was true in another life, when Ignis first learned to harness the eternal flames. You need to meditate on the core, not the blaze. Start with the spark and let it grow naturally. Otherwise, you'll burn yourself out. For a moment, she just stared at him, confusion and something else, a flicker of recognition, crossing her face. Then, as if triggered by his words, the air around her grew hot. A wisp of flame escaped her control, curling from her palm like a serpent. It flared, bright and sudden, licking at the stone wall and leaving a blackened streak. Arya gasped, clamping her hand shut. The flame died, but the damage was done. Her eyes met Elias's, filled with shock and a dawning horror. "That's never happened before," she whispered. "I've always had perfect control. Until now." Elias watched as the last embers faded. The flare had been brief, but it carried the echo of old power, the same chaotic energy that Ignis had wielded on the battlefield. It was a hint, a crack in the facade of her modern training. And it was exactly what he'd feared. Her current methods were suppressing her true potential, and the strain was starting to show. "See," he said softly. "You have your own problems to solve. Don't waste time on me." He turned to leave, but Arya grabbed his arm. Her grip was firm, her skin still warm from the outburst. "Elias, wait. How did you know that would happen? How do you know so much about fire magic?" He looked back at her, seeing not just the student, but the general she had been. The loyalty, the fierceness, the unyielding will. For a heartbeat, he wanted to tell her everything, to reveal the throne they had once shared, the wars they had fought, the empire they had built. But the risk was too great. Valerius was watching. Lyra was suspicious. And Grimshaw's terrified face was a fresh reminder of what happened when he stepped out of the shadows. "I read a lot," he repeated, the same weak excuse. Then he pulled away, walking down the corridor without looking back. Behind him, Arya stood frozen, her hands still outstretched. The scent of ozone and burned stone hung in the air. And in her mind, a memory stirred, not clear, but visceral. A vision of a dark throne room, of kneeling before a figure wreathed in shadow, of flames that obeyed not her will, but his command. She shook her head, trying to dispel the image, but it clung like smoke. Elias rounded the corner, his heart a steady drumbeat in his chest. The encounter had been dangerous, but necessary. Arya's was a warning, her past was clawing its way to the surface, and her modern training was a cage that could break at any moment. He needed to guide her, to guide all of them, before their ignorance got them killed. But every step he took risked exposure. As he walked, he felt the weight of the legacy of annihilation, like a mantle across his shoulders. Millennia of knowledge, of power, of ruin, all trapped in this weak, mocked body. And somewhere in the academy, Headmaster Valerius was digging into his past, Grimshaw was nursing a shattered ego, and Lyra was piecing together visions of a dark throne. The storm was gathering. And Elias, the F-rank trash, was standing at its eye. The scent of charred wood and ozone hung thick in the air of the girls' dormitory common room. Arya stood in the center of the devastation, her hands trembling as she stared at the blackened section of wall where moments before there had been a tapestry depicting the academy's founding. Wisps of smoke still curled from the scorched stone, and the floorboards beneath her feet were blistered and cracked. She hadn't meant to do it. One moment she'd been practicing the basic flame control exercises Professor Ignatius had assigned, simple candle lighting techniques every first year mastered, and the next, something had snapped inside her. A surge of heat unlike anything she'd ever felt had erupted from her core, and the delicate flame she'd been nurturing had exploded into a roaring inferno that licked the ceiling before she could contain it. Now, as other students peered nervously from doorways, their whispers carrying through the hallway, Arya felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This wasn't normal. Not even for an A-rank fire mage. The flames had felt familiar. As if they'd been waiting for her, coiled deep within her soul, and something had finally triggered their release. Elias. His warning echoed in her mind. Your fire control is flawed. You're holding back what wants to be free. At the time, she dismissed it as the ramblings of an F-rank student trying to sound important. But now, with her hands still tingling with residual heat and the evidence of her failure smoldering before her, she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something. Something about her that even she didn't understand. Elias was in the academy's eastern courtyard when he felt it, a ripple in the magical currents that shouldn't have been there. He paused in his slow walk toward the library, his senses stretching outward. It was faint, like the echo of a distant explosion, but he recognized the signature immediately. Ignis. Or rather, what remained of her. He closed his eyes, letting the legacy of annihilation parse the information. The fire had been uncontrolled, yes, but there was a purity to it that modern magic lacked. A raw, untamed power that spoke of ancient lineages and forgotten battles. It was the same energy he'd felt millennia ago when Ignis had stood at his side, her flames consuming entire armies. Trouble? Elias opened his eyes to find Arya standing before him. Her usually immaculate uniform was smudged with soot, and there was a wildness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She looked like a cornered animal, proud but terrified of what she might become. "You warned me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About my fire. How did you know?" Elias considered his words carefully. The courtyard was mostly empty at this hour, with only a few students studying under the ancient oak trees at the far end. But walls had ears, and in an academy filled with mages, even whispered conversations could be overheard. "I saw the tension in your shoulders during class," he said, falling back on the lie he'd prepared. "The way you hold your hands when you cast. You're fighting against your own magic instead of working with it." Arya shook her head. "That's not it. What happened just now, it wasn't just losing control. It felt like something woke up inside me. Something old." She took a step closer, her gaze intense. "You know something. Tell me." For a moment, Elias was tempted. The girl before him was his general, one of the few beings in any era who had earned his respect. She deserved the truth. But the truth would get them both killed. The Academy would never tolerate the Demon King walking among them, and Arya, if she remembered who she had been, what would she do? Would she embrace her past? Or would she see him as the monster history painted him to be? "I can help you control it," he said instead. "But not here." They met in one of the abandoned practice rooms deep in the Academy's sublevels. The room was small and windowless, with walls of reinforced stone that had been charred black by countless spells over the centuries. It was the perfect place for what Elias had in mind: isolated, soundproofed, and saturated with enough residual magic to mask their own. Arya stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed. "All right. We're alone. Now tell me what you know." "First, sit," Elias said, gesturing to the floor. "And clear your mind." "I don't need meditation lessons," she snapped, but there was less heat in her words than before. The incident in the dorm had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Elias didn't respond. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, his posture relaxed but precise. It was the same position he'd taught Ignis 10,000 years ago, when she'd first come to him as a young fire elemental struggling to contain her power. After a moment's hesitation, Arya sat opposite him, mimicking his posture. "Fine. Now what?" "Close your eyes. Breathe. And don't try to control the fire. Just listen to it." Arya gave him a skeptical look but did as he said. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was their breathing. Then, slowly, a faint orange glow began to emanate from Arya's hands. It started as a gentle warmth, but quickly grew hotter, the air around her shimmering with heat. "It's getting stronger," she said, her voice tight with strain. "Don't fight it," Elias said, his own voice calm and measured. "Remember what it felt like when it first awakened. That moment of pure release. Find that feeling again." Arya's brow furrowed in concentration. The glow intensified, tendrils of flame licking up her arms. She was losing control again, he could see it in the way her muscles tensed, in the panic that flashed across her face. Then Elias began to speak. Not in the common tongue of the Academy, but in the ancient language of the demon courts, a language of power and precision that had been dead for millennia. Asterisk Kael'thora vas Ignis. Vexna Relshan asterisk. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a power that had nothing to do with volume. Arya's eyes flew open, and for a moment, Elias saw recognition there. Not conscious understanding, but something deeper. A soul memory. The flames around her didn't diminish. Instead, they changed. The wild, uncontrolled inferno coalesced into a single, perfect sphere of fire that hovered between her palms. It burned with a blue-white intensity that should have been impossible for a student, its light casting sharp shadows across the room. Arya stared at it, her expression one of awe and terror. What is this?" Your true potential, Elias said softly. Or a fraction of it. He watched as she experimented with the sphere, guiding it through the air with subtle movements of her fingers. It responded with a precision that modern fire magic couldn't match, leaving no trail of heat unless she willed it. This was battle magic. The kind of controlled, devastating power that had made Ignis one of his most feared generals. After nearly an hour, Arya finally let the sphere dissipate. The room cooled rapidly, leaving only the scent of ozone and the memory of heat. She looked at Elias, her earlier suspicion replaced by something more complicated. How? She asked again. How do you know these things? That language. I shouldn't have understood it, but I did. Not the words, but the meaning. Like a dream I'd forgotten. Elias rose to his feet, brushing dust from his trousers. I read it in an old book, he said, repeating the lie he'd prepared. In the restricted section of the library. There are texts there that predate the Academy. Ancient magic that's been forgotten. It was a plausible explanation. The Academy's library did have a restricted section, though most of the truly dangerous texts had been destroyed or locked away centuries ago. And it was just believable enough that an ambitious student might have found a way in. Arya didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she said, "Teach me more." Kale had been following Elias since he left the courtyard. It had started as curiosity, what business did the Academy's top fire mage have with F-rank trash, but had quickly turned to suspicion when he saw them heading for the sublevels together. He'd waited outside the practice room, his enhanced hearing picking up fragments of their conversation. Most of it had been too muffled to make out, but he'd heard the change in Arya's voice when she'd asked how. That note of awe and confusion. And he'd felt the surge of power that followed a heat so intense it had seeped through the stone door. Now, as Elias emerged alone and made his way toward the library, Kale followed at a distance, his movements silent and precise. It was a skill he'd honed in the Academy's combat classes, but it felt older than that. Natural, as if he'd been doing it for lifetimes. He watched as Elias entered the library, bypassing the main study areas and heading straight for the ancient history section. Not the restricted area, as he'd claimed to Arya, but the publicly accessible shelves filled with dusty tomes about forgotten wars and dead civilizations. Kale lingered behind a bookshelf, watching as Elias pulled a volume from the shelf, The Fall of the Dark Kingdoms, a historical analysis, and began flipping through it with a familiarity that belied his supposed ignorance. His movements were too sure, his focus too intense for someone just browsing. When Elias finally left the library an hour later, Kale made his decision. He intercepted him in a narrow corridor between the history and arcane theory sections, where the shelves rose to the ceiling and the only light came from magically sustained crystals embedded in the stone. "We need to talk," Kale said, blocking Elias's path. Elias didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked resigned, as if he'd been expecting this. "About what?" "About what you're really doing here," Kale said, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his practice sword. It was an unconscious gesture, one he'd made 1,000 times before, but this time it felt different. More deliberate. "Arya came to me after your little session. She showed me what you taught her. That fire, it's not Academy magic. It's not even modern magic. It's an ancient technique," Elias said, repeating his lie. "From a book." "Which book?" Kale pressed. "Show me." For a long moment, Elias just looked at him. And in that moment, Kale saw something in the other boy's eyes that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't fear or defiance. It was recognition. As if Elias was looking at someone he'd known for a very long time, and was disappointed by what he saw. "Your stance is off," Elias said suddenly, his gaze dropping to Kale's feet. "You're favoring your left side. An old injury, maybe? Or just a bad habit you picked up from watching the wrong teachers?" Kale stiffened. How had he known about the old injury? He'd broken his left ankle during a training exercise 2 years ago, and while it had healed perfectly, he did sometimes favor it without thinking. But he'd never told anyone. Not even his closest friends. "What are you?" Kale asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A spy?" Some kind of sleeper agent? Elias's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. I'm a student. Just like you. Bullshit, Kale said, and this time he drew his sword. Not all the way, but enough that the blade gleamed in the dim light. Students don't know ancient languages. They don't teach magic that predates the academy. And they definitely don't look at Arya like you did, like you were remembering something. The corridor was utterly silent now. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour, but the sound felt muffled, as if the very air between them had grown thick with tension. Elias took a step forward. Not toward the exit, but toward Kale. If you're going to draw your sword, he said quietly, then draw it properly. Half measures get people killed. Kale's grip tightened on the hilt. Every instinct he had was screaming at him that this was wrong, that Elias was dangerous, that he should call for a teacher or retreat and regroup. But another part of him, deeper, older, was curious. This F-rank student who moved like a seasoned warrior, who spoke with the certainty of someone who had seen empires rise and fall, who was he really? Answers, Kale said, his sword now fully drawn. Now. Elias looked at the blade, then at Kale's face. And for the first time, Kale saw something like pity in his expression. You're asking the wrong questions, Elias said. But if you insist on answers, meet me in the eastern courtyard at dawn. Come alone. And bring your best sword. Not that practice toy. Before Kale could respond, Elias turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows between the bookshelves. Kale stood there for a long time, his sword still raised, the echo of those words hanging in the air. Bring your best sword. As if Elias knew he had one. As if he knew exactly what Kale was capable of. And the terrifying part was, Kale had the sudden, unshakable feeling that he did. The eastern courtyard of the Arcane Academy was a place of stark contrasts at dawn. Pale light filtered through the ancient stone arches, casting long shadows across the flagstones worn smooth by centuries of student footsteps. Mist clung to the ground like ghostly fingers, swirling around the base of the training dummies that stood sentinel along the perimeter. The air carried the crisp scent of dew and old magic, a faint, metallic tang that Elias recognized from battlefields long forgotten. Kale stood at the center of the courtyard, his posture rigid with tension. He wore the standard academy combat uniform, dark trousers and a fitted tunic that allowed for movement but had foregone the protective padding. In his right hand, he held his sword, a well-crafted blade of polished steel that caught the first rays of sunlight. His knuckles were white around the hilt. Elias approached from the opposite side, his footsteps silent on the damp stones. He wore the same simple student robes he always did, looking every bit the frail F-rank mage everyone believed him to be. But his eyes, those ancient, knowing eyes, held a stillness that belied his appearance. He stopped 10 paces from Kale, his hands loose at his sides. You came, Kale said, his voice tight. I wasn't sure you would. You issued a challenge, Elias replied, his tone even. It would be rude to decline. Kale's jaw tightened. This isn't a game, Elias. I heard you with Arya yesterday. That meditation technique, it's not something you find in the beginners section of the library. And the way you spoke about fire control, you sounded like a master, not a student who can barely light a candle. Elias allowed a faint smile. Observation is a skill, Kale. One you seem to have neglected in your pursuit of brute strength. Don't patronize me, Kale snapped. He took a step forward, his sword rising slightly. Who are you really? A spy from another academy? Some noble's bastard sent here to sabotage us? Or something worse? Worse? Elias echoed, tilting his head. What do you imagine I am? I don't know, Kale admitted, frustration bleeding into his voice. But you're hiding something. Your movements, your knowledge, it doesn't match your rank. Yesterday, when you corrected my stance during drills, you pinpointed a flaw even Master Thorn hadn't noticed. And now Arya's flames are burning brighter than ever after 5 minutes with you. Coincidence? I don't think so. Elias studied him, the memories rising unbidden. Vorax, that had been Kale's name in another life. A general who could cleave through armored lines with a single swing, whose laughter echoed across blood-soaked fields. Now he was a boy with a too serious face and a sword he didn't truly understand. "Your suspicion is understandable," Elias said at last. "But you're asking the wrong questions. Instead of worrying about who I am, you should be asking why your sword forms are so flawed." Kale's eyes narrowed. "Flawed? I've won every tournament I've entered. My techniques are approved by the combat masters." "Approval doesn't make them effective," Elias said, his voice dropping into a lecturing tone that felt unnaturally natural. "Watch." He didn't move to attack. Instead, he gestured toward Kale's stance. "You're favoring your right side. Your weight is distributed 60% on your front foot, which limits your pivot options. Your grip is too tight, it's slowing your recovery by a fraction of a second with each swing. And your guard," Elias shook his head. "You leave your left flank open every time you prepare for an overhead strike. Against a skilled opponent, that's an invitation to be gutted." Kale stared at him, disbelief warring with anger. "You're criticizing my form? You, who've never held a sword in your life?" "I don't need to hold one to see its weaknesses," Elias said. "Physics is physics, whether it's in this era or any other. Your body is a system of levers and pivots. Your sword is an extension of that system. Right now, you're working against yourself." A muscle twitched in Kale's cheek. "Prove it." Elias raised an eyebrow. "How?" "A duel," Kale said, his voice hardening. "No magic. Just blades, or in your case, whatever you can pick up." He gestured toward a rack of practice weapons against the wall. "If you're so knowledgeable, show me." For a moment, Elias considered refusing. The risk of exposure was real, every move he made could awaken something in Kale's buried memories. But the alternative was worse. If Kale remained suspicious, he might dig deeper, might start asking questions that could lead to the truth. And that truth, revealed too soon, could destroy everything. "Very well," Elias said. He walked to the weapon rack, his movements deliberate. His fingers brushed over wooden swords, weighted clubs, and blunt training daggers. He selected a simple short staff, about 3 feet of polished oak, worn smooth from use. It was nothing compared to Kale's steel, but it would serve. He returned to the center of the courtyard, hefting the staff in one hand. "Rules? First to disarm the other," Kale said. "Or yield. No killing blows, obviously." "Obviously," Elias echoed, a ghost of amusement in his eyes. "Begin when you're ready." Kale didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his sword flashing in a horizontal arc aimed at Elias's midsection. It was a controlled strike, fast, precise, and meant to test rather than injure. But to Elias, it moved with the sluggish predictability of a child's swing. He didn't block. Instead, he took a half step back, letting the blade pass inches from his robes. As Kale's momentum carried him forward, Elias tapped the end of his staff against the inside of Kale's wrist, a light, almost casual touch. Kale jerked back, more surprised than hurt. "Lucky dodge," he muttered. "Was it?" Elias asked. "Your attack committed your entire body weight to the swing. If I had sidestepped and struck your leading knee, you'd be on the ground right now." "Then do it," Kale challenged, his pride stung. He came again, this time with a series of quick thrusts, high, low, high, each aimed with the precision of a tournament champion. Elias moved with an economy of motion that seemed impossible for someone of his supposed skill level. He deflected the first thrust with a subtle twist of his staff, redirected the second by angling his body, and simply leaned away from the third. "You're telegraphing," Elias said as he moved. Your shoulders tense before each thrust. Your eyes drop to your target a half second too early. And your footwork, you're stepping into each attack when you should be driving from your hips. Stop talking and fight. Kale snapped, frustration boiling over. He switched to a more aggressive pattern, combining slashes with feints. His sword became a blur of motion, cutting through the morning air with whistling sounds. Elias parried twice, the wood of his staff ringing against steel, but mostly he evaded, shifting, turning, always just out of reach. To an observer, it would have looked like Kale was dominating the duel. But Kale himself felt a growing unease. Every time he thought he had Elias cornered, the F-rank student would slip away with infuriating ease. And those calm, analytical comments kept coming, each one pinpointing another flaw in his technique. "Your recovery after a wide slash is too slow," Elias said as he ducked under a swing. "You're over-rotating your shoulders." "Shut up," Kale growled, putting more force into his next attack. It was a mistake. As he brought his sword down in a powerful overhead strike, Elias didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped inside the arc of the blow, his staff coming up not to block, but to guide. The movement was so fluid it seemed rehearsed. Elias's staff met Kale's sword arm just above the elbow, applying pressure at exactly the right angle to disrupt the strike without opposing its force. At the same time, his other hand shot forward, fingers pressing into a specific point below Kale's collarbone. Kale's arm went numb. Not completely, just enough that his grip faltered. His sword, already off balance from the redirected strike, slipped from his fingers. It hit the flagstones with a metallic clang that echoed through the silent courtyard. 3 moves. From start to disarming, it had taken exactly 3 moves. Kale stared at his empty hand, then at his sword lying on the ground. His breath came in ragged gasps. He hadn't even seen the disarming technique coming. One moment he was attacking, the next his weapon was gone. "How?" he began, but the word died in his throat. Elias lowered his staff, his expression unreadable. "You rely too much on strength and speed," he said quietly. "But combat isn't about overpowering your opponent. It's about understanding their body better than they do. That point below your collarbone, it's a nerve cluster. Pressure there causes temporary muscle weakness. Your sword form leaves it exposed every time you raise your arms for an overhead strike." Kale didn't respond. He was still staring at his hand, which had begun to tremble. Not from fear or exhaustion, but from something deeper, a memory scratching at the edges of his consciousness. He'd seen that move before. Not in a training yard or tournament, but somewhere else. Somewhere dark and chaotic, where the air smelled of sulfur and blood. There had been a figure on a throne, watching as 2 generals sparred in a courtyard of black stone. One of them, a warrior with crimson armor, had used that exact technique. A quick step inside the guard, pressure on the nerve cluster, and his opponent's weapon had clattered to the ground. The memory was fragmented, like a dream half remembered upon waking. But the feeling was unmistakable. Deja vu so intense it made his stomach clench. "Who taught you that?" Kale whispered, his eyes lifting to meet Elias's. "No one taught me," Elias said. He set his staff aside, the wood making a soft thump against the stones. "It's simply a matter of anatomy and physics. Anyone with the right knowledge could do it." "But no one does," Kale insisted. His trembling hand curled into a fist. "That's not an academy technique. It's not even a noble house secret. I've studied combat styles from 3 continents, and I've never seen anything like it." Elias held his gaze. "Perhaps your studies were incomplete." "Don't," Kale said, the word sharp. "Don't treat me like a fool. You're not what you seem. You move like someone who's fought in real battles. Not tournament bouts, but life and death struggles." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The mist began to thin as the sun rose higher, painting the courtyard in gold and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the signal for morning classes to begin. "What do you want from me, Kale?" Elias asked at last. "Do you want me to admit I'm not an ordinary student?" "Very well. I'm not. But I'm not your enemy either." "Then what are you?" "A guide," Elias said softly. "Someone who sees the flaws in this academy's teachings. Someone who knows that the techniques you're learning will get you killed against a real threat." Kale's eyes narrowed. "You sound like you've seen those threats." "I have," Elias said, and for the first time, something ancient and weary showed in his face. "More than you can imagine." He turned to leave, but Kale's voice stopped him. "Wait." Elias paused, looking back over his shoulder. Kale bent to retrieve his sword, his movements slow, deliberate. When he straightened, the blade was in his hand again, but he made no move to raise it. Instead, he studied Elias with new intensity. "That move," he said. "The disarming technique. I've seen it before. In a dream, maybe. Or a memory that isn't mine." Elias's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked. "Dreams can be strange things." This wasn't strange, Kale insisted. His sword hand was still trembling, the tremor slight but persistent. "It felt real. Like I was there. And you were there too, but different. Older. Wearing armor I've never seen in any history book." The words hung between them, dangerous and revealing. Elias knew he should deflect, should make some dismissive comment about overactive imaginations. But looking at Kale, at Vorax, his loyal general, struggling to remember a past life, he felt a surge of something perilously close to affection. "Some memories run deeper than others," Elias said carefully. "Sometimes they surface at unexpected moments." "Is that what this is?" Kale asked. "A memory?" "Perhaps." Elias took a step toward him, lowering his voice. "But be careful, Kale. Not all memories are meant to be awakened. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again." He turned fully now, facing the swordsman. "I won't ask for your trust. But I will ask for your discretion. What happened here today, what you're feeling, keep it to yourself. For now." "Why?" Kale demanded. "If you're not a threat, why the secrecy?" "Because there are threats you haven't imagined yet," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And when they come, you'll need every advantage you can get. Even if that advantage comes from an F-rank student who shouldn't know how to disarm a champion in 3 moves. He didn't wait for a response. Turning on his heel, Elias walked away, his robes whispering against the damp stones. The morning bell tolled again, louder this time, calling students to their classes. Kale stood alone in the courtyard, his sword hanging loosely at his side. He watched Elias disappear through an archway, his mind racing. The trembling in his hand had spread up his arm now, a subtle vibration that felt less like fear and more like recognition. He looked down at his sword, at the way the light gleamed along its edge. And suddenly, without understanding why, he remembered a name. Not his own name, but another. Vorax. The sound of it echoed in his mind like a distant battle cry. His fingers tightened around the hilt. The tremor intensified, becoming a shake that traveled through his entire body. He tried to still it, but the memory, if that's what it was, refused to be quieted. A battlefield stretched before his mind's eye, vast and terrible. A throne of black obsidian. And a figure upon it, watching him with eyes that held millennia of knowledge. Elias's eyes. Kale's breath caught in his throat. The sword slipped from his grip again, this time because his hand had gone completely numb. It hit the ground with another clang, but he barely heard it. All he could hear was the echo of a voice from a forgotten past, speaking words he shouldn't remember but somehow did. "Well fought, Vorax. But your guard is still too high." And as the sun fully cleared the horizon, bathing the courtyard in light, Kale realized with dawning horror that the voice had been Elias's. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arcane Academy's central arena, a massive stone amphitheater that could seat thousands. Banners in the Academy's colors, deep blue and silver, fluttered in the breeze, while students filled the stands with a buzzing energy that felt almost tangible. For Elias, standing at the edge of the competitor's entrance, the scene was both familiar and alien. In his past life as Zogaroth, he had overseen tournaments in arenas carved from obsidian, where the stakes were life and death. Here, the air smelled of roasted nuts and youthful excitement, the threats theoretical rather than literal. Yet the tension in his shoulders was real. After his encounter with Kale 2 days prior, whispers had followed him through the halls. The Star Swordsman had been unusually quiet, his gaze lingering on Elias during classes with an intensity that spoke of awakening memories. Elias kept his head down, but the Academy's announcement of the spring tournament had changed everything. Participation was mandatory for all combat track students, and someone, likely one of the bullies who found him an easy target, had signed him up as a joke entry. "Look who decided to show up," a voice sneered from behind. Elias didn't need to turn to recognize Garrett, a burly earth mage with a reputation for targeting weaker students. "Think he'll last more than 5 seconds, trash?" Elias remained silent, his eyes scanning the tournament bracket posted on a nearby board. His name, Elias Thorne, was listed in the first round against Garrett. The match was scheduled for the third slot, deliberately placed early to maximize humiliation, he suspected. Around him, other students chattered excitedly, their magic flaring in small displays of pre-fight nerves. Arya stood with her fire mage cohort, flames dancing at her fingertips as she warmed up. Kale was sharpening his sword with a focused intensity, though his eyes flicked toward Elias more than once. Lyra, the healer, moved through the crowd with a serene expression, her hands glowing with soft green light as she offered last-minute blessings. Headmaster Valerius's voice boomed through the arena, amplified by magic. "Welcome, students and faculty, to the annual spring tournament. May your skills shine, and may the best mage prevail." The crowd roared, and the first match began, a flashy duel between two lightning element users that ended with a spectacular but inefficient display of sparks. Elias watched with detached analysis. Modern magic, he noted, prioritized spectacle over efficiency. The spells were bloated with unnecessary flourishes, the mana channels poorly optimized. In his era, such waste would have been punished by immediate death on the battlefield. He felt the weight of the legacy of Annihilation stirring in his mind, a library of millennia-old knowledge itching to be used. But he clamped down on it, forcing his breathing to remain steady. Exposure was not an option, not yet. When his name was called, a ripple of laughter spread through the stands. Garrett swaggered into the arena, cracking his knuckles. "Ready to eat dirt, F-rank?" he taunted, already weaving earth magic into a defensive shell around himself. Elias stepped onto the sand-covered floor, the grains crunching under his boots. The referee, a stern-faced teacher, explained the rules: no lethal spells, surrender, or knockout for victory. Elias nodded, his mind already working. Garrett's earth shell was a standard academy technique, layered granite reinforced with mana. To most students, it was impenetrable. But Elias saw the flaws immediately. The mana flow was uneven, creating weak points at the joints where the shell segments met. "Begin," the referee shouted. Garrett didn't hesitate. He stomped his foot, and spikes of rock shot from the ground toward Elias. It was a brutish attack, meant to overwhelm with force. Elias didn't dodge in the conventional sense. Instead, he took a single step to the side, his movement minimal and precise, letting the spikes pass harmlessly by inches. The crowd murmured in surprise. "Luck," they assumed. "Stand still," Garrett growled, conjuring a boulder above his head and hurling it. Elias didn't even look at it. His eyes were fixed on Garrett's mana signature, visible to him as a shimmering network of light beneath the earth shell. There, at the left hip joint, a flicker of instability. As the boulder descended, Elias raised a hand, not to block, but to trace a tiny, almost invisible rune in the air. It was a dispelling glyph from the Age of Ashes, a technique so ancient it had been forgotten. He channeled a minuscule amount of his own mana, not enough to register on any sensor, and directed it toward the weak point. The effect was instantaneous. Garrett's earth shell didn't shatter, it simply unraveled, the granite dissolving into dust as the mana holding it together dissipated. Garrett stumbled, his concentration broken, the boulder above him wavering. In that moment of confusion, Elias moved. He didn't use magic. He simply walked forward, placed a hand on Garrett's shoulder, and pushed. Off balance and startled, Garrett toppled onto the sand. Silence. Then the referee's voice cut through the stillness. "Elias Thorne wins by knockdown." The crowd erupted into confused chatter. Some cheered ironically, others booed. Teachers in the stands leaned forward, their expressions puzzled. How had an F-rank student dismantled the C-rank's defense without casting a single offensive spell? Elias kept his face blank, offering a hand to help Garrett up. The bully slapped it away, his face red with humiliation. "What did you do?" Garrett hissed. "Your shell had a design flaw," Elias said quietly, turning away before Garrett could respond. As he walked back to the competitors' area, he felt eyes on him, Aria's curious gaze, Kale's intense scrutiny, and from the high platform, Headmaster Valerius's thoughtful stare. The tournament progressed. Elias won his next 2 matches in similar fashion, exploiting subtle loopholes in his opponent's magic. Against a water mage, he disrupted the molecular cohesion of a tidal wave with a whispered syllable, causing it to collapse into harmless mist. Against an illusionist, he simply walked through the illusions, his ancient mind recognizing the patterns as child's play. Each victory was met with growing unease. The jokes had stopped. Now, students whispered about cheating or hidden talent. Teachers exchanged concerned looks. By the semifinals, only 4 competitors remained: Aria, Kale, Lyra, and Elias. The bracket paired Elias against Lyra. As they waited for their match, Lyra approached him in the preparation area, her healer's robes pristine against the dusty backdrop. "Elias," she said, her voice gentle but edged with something he couldn't place. "Your matches, they're unusual. You're not using magic the way we're taught." "I'm just observant," Elias replied, keeping his tone neutral. Up close, he could feel the resonance of her soul, a familiar echo, though muted. In her past life, she had been Nethra, his healer general, whose powers could mend flesh and unravel curses with equal ease. Now, she was Lyra, a talented student whose healing magic was praised but limited. Observant enough to dismantle advanced spells without incantations? Lyra's eyes narrowed. "After the dungeon incident, I've been watching you. There's a darkness around you. Not evil, but old. Ancient." Elias's heart rate didn't change, but internally, he was alert. Lyra's sensitivity was stronger than he'd anticipated. "I read a lot of old books," he deflected. Before she could press further, their match was called. They stepped into the arena together, the crowd's attention fully on them. Lyra took her position, her hands already glowing with the soft green light of healing magic. But Elias noticed something off. The light had a faint, jagged edge to it, like cracks in glass. Corruption, he realized. Her power was awakening, but without proper guidance, it was twisting. "Begin." Lyra didn't attack immediately. Instead, she raised a barrier of healing energy, a defensive technique meant to absorb and neutralize incoming spells. "I won't underestimate you, Elias," she said, her voice carrying across the arena. "Show me what you can really do." Elias nodded. He had to be careful. Direct confrontation risked exposing too much, but losing might raise different suspicions. He decided on a middle path, testing the limits of her corrupted power while appearing to struggle. He cast a simple firebolt, Academy standard, weak and slow. Lyra's barrier absorbed it easily, the green light flaring brighter. Then, something unexpected happened. The barrier didn't just absorb the firebolt, it reflected it back, amplified. A stream of green-tinged fire shot toward Elias, far hotter and faster than his original spell. Lyra's eyes widened in shock. "I didn't mean to." Elias sidestepped, the fire scorching the sand where he'd stood. He recognized the technique instantly. It was a corrupted version of Nethra's Vitality Reversal, a spell that could turn healing energy into destructive force. In its pure form, it required precise control and a deep understanding of life and death energies. In Lyra's hands, it was unstable, dangerous. "Lyra, focus." Elias called out, dropping his pretense of weakness. "Your mana flow is too aggressive, you're forcing the healing energy into an offensive shape without the proper channels." Lyra stared at him, confusion and fear warring on her face. "How do you know that?" But she didn't have time to ponder. The corrupted magic was reacting to her emotional turmoil. The green light around her began to pulse erratically, tendrils of energy lashing out uncontrollably. One tendril struck the arena wall, and stone cracked with a sound like thunder. The crowd gasped, some rising from their seats. "Lyra, stop!" Aria shouted from the sidelines. Kale was already moving toward the edge of the arena, but teachers held him back. "It's too dangerous," one yelled. Lyra tried to rein in the magic, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with her bare hands. The energy swelled, forming a chaotic vortex around her. sand lifted into the air, spinning in a maelstrom of green and gray. Elias could see the corruption spreading, the magic was feeding on her fear, twisting into something that could detonate with enough force to level the arena. Memories flashed in his mind, Nethra, in the throne room of his dark castle, demonstrating the delicate balance of life and death. "My king," she had said, "this power is a double-edged sword. Without control, it consumes the wielder." Elias didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, ignoring the teacher's shouts to stay back. The vortex of energy was deafening now, a howl of mismatched frequencies. Lyra was at its center, her eyes wide with terror, her hands trembling as she tried to contain the storm. "Lyra!" Elias's voice cut through the noise, not loud, but imbued with a command that resonated with ancient authority. He didn't use modern magic. Instead, he reached into the legacy of Annihilation and pulled forth a single word from the old tongue, the language of demons and primordial forces. It was a word of calming, of order, one he had used to quell rebellions in his empire. Asterisk carries, asterisk, he whispered, the syllable barely audible. The effect was immediate. The chaotic energy didn't vanish, it stilled, as if frozen in time. The tendrils retracted, the vortex dissipated, and the green light dimmed to a soft glow around Lyra. She collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily, tears streaking her face. Silence engulfed the arena. Then, the whispers began. What was that? Did he just command her magic? That wasn't any spell, I know. Elias stood over Lyra, his own heart pounding. He had revealed too much. The old tongue was not taught at the Arcane Academy, it was forbidden, lost to history except in the darkest of tomes. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, including Headmaster Valerius's, which bore into him with a mixture of suspicion and dawning understanding. Lyra looked up at him, her expression a tapestry of confusion, gratitude, and something deeper, a flicker of recognition. That word, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've heard it before. In a dream. A dark throne, and a voice. Before she could finish, the arena's protective wards flickered. The residual energy from the corrupted magic had strained them to their limits. With a sound like shattering glass, a section of the ward above them cracked, and raw magical feedback surged downward, a cascade of unstable energy heading straight for the center of the arena where they stood. Elias's eyes widened. This wasn't part of the tournament. This was a catastrophic failure, one that could kill everyone nearby if it hit. Lyra's haywire magic had weakened the wards, and now the backlash was imminent. The energy glowed with a sickly purple light, crackling with destructive potential. Time seemed to slow. Elias could see the teachers scrambling to reinforce the wards, but they were too slow. Arya was shouting, Kale was breaking free from the teacher's hold. And Lyra, exhausted and vulnerable, was directly in the path of the cascade. Without thinking, Elias moved. He placed himself between Lyra and the incoming energy, raising his hands. He couldn't use a grand spell without full exposure, but he didn't need to. The legacy of Annihilation provided the answer, a minor ward from the Age of Ashes, designed to deflect magical feedback. He traced a series of runes in the air, his movements swift and precise, channeling just enough mana to make them visible. The purple energy struck his ward. For a moment, it held, shimmering like a fragile soap bubble. Then, with a deafening roar, it exploded. The blast wave threw Elias backward, slamming him into the arena wall. Pain lanced through his body, but he forced his eyes open. The arena was filled with smoke and dust. Lyra was safe, shielded by the remnants of his ward. But around them, the arena was damaged, cracked spiderweb through the stone, and the wards were completely down. As the dust settled, the crowd's silence broke into panicked shouts. Teachers rushed onto the sand. Headmaster Valerius descended from his platform, his expression grim. And Elias, pushing himself up with a groan, knew that the cliffhanger of his hidden identity had just become a precipice. Lyra's magic had gone haywire, threatening to explode the arena, and he had stopped it with knowledge no student should possess. The tournament was over, but the real trial was about to begin. The silence that followed Elias's whispered command was absolute, broken only by the faint crackle of dissipating magic and the ragged breathing of Lyra, who stood trembling at the center of the arena. Her hands, which moments before had been glowing with unstable, corrupted energy, now hung limp at her sides. The violent purple and gold aura that had threatened to tear the tournament grounds apart had vanished, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and burnt mana. Elias lowered his own hand, the subtle gesture he'd used to channel the ancient command now hidden in the folds of his academy robes. Around him, the damaged arena told the story of what had nearly happened. The stone floor was cracked in a spiderweb pattern radiating from where Lyra had stood, and the magical wards that lined the perimeter flickered erratically, their blue light dimmed by the feedback cascade he'd barely contained. He could feel the eyes of hundreds upon him, students, teachers, the entire gathered crowd of the Arcane Academy's spring tournament, all staring with a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning suspicion. Lyra took a shaky step forward, her face pale beneath her chestnut hair. What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her healing magic, usually a gentle green glow, still sparked erratically around her fingertips, reacting to the residual energy of the old tongue command. That word. I've never heard anything like it. It felt ancient. Elias met her gaze, his own expression carefully neutral. Inside, his mind raced. The command he'd used *Kaldoresh* was a term of binding from the demonic dialects of his past life, one meant to quell rogue magical energies. It had worked, but at a cost. He could see the recognition in Lyra's eyes, not of him, but of the power itself. She might not remember being his general, Sana, the mistress of life and decay, but her soul still resonated with the echoes of that era. I read it in an old text, Elias said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his weak, F-rank body. The life felt flimsy even to him, but it was all he had. A compendium on magical stabilization. It was a guess. Lyra's brow furrowed. No student has access to those kinds of texts. And that wasn't just stabilization, it was a command. It felt like it reached into my magic and forced it to obey. She took another step closer, her healer's instincts warring with her confusion. Elias, who are you really? Before he could answer, a heavy hand fell on his shoulder. Elias didn't need to turn to know who it was, the aura of controlled, authoritative magic was unmistakable. Headmaster Valerius stood beside him, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. The headmaster's face was grave, his sharp eyes missing nothing as they scanned the damaged arena and the stunned crowd. Enough, Valerius said, his voice carrying across the silent grounds without need for amplification magic. The tournament is suspended. All students, return to your dorms. Teachers, secure the arena and tend to any injuries. A murmur rippled through the crowd, then grew into a buzz of confused chatter. Students began to shuffle out of the stands, casting backward glances at Elias and Lyra. Arya, from the sidelines, watched with wide eyes, her fiery hair seeming to dim with concern. Kale stood rigid nearby, his hand resting on the hilt of his practice sword, his expression unreadable but intense. Valerius's grip on Elias's shoulder tightened slightly. Elias, Lyra, with me. Now. Elias nodded, falling into step beside the headmaster as they moved toward the academy's main building. Lyra followed a pace behind, her steps hesitant. Elias could feel the weight of her gaze on his back, and the stares of the remaining teachers and students. His mind worked through scenarios. Valerius was no fool, the headmaster had studied magical history extensively, and the use of the old tongue would not have gone unnoticed. The question was how much he suspected. The walk to the headmaster's office was tense and silent. The corridors of the Arcane Academy, usually bustling with student activity, were eerily quiet in the aftermath of the tournament's abrupt end. Elias noted the intricate carvings on the walls, depictions of legendary mages in great battles, and felt a pang of irony. Among those historical reliefs, there were likely images of his own defeat, sanitized for academic consumption. Valerius's office was a spacious room on the top floor of the central tower, lined with bookshelves filled with ancient tomes and artifacts. A large window overlooked the academy grounds, and a heavy oak desk dominated the center. The headmaster gestured for Elias and Lyra to sit in the chairs opposite the desk, then took his own seat, steepling his fingers as he studied them. Lyra, Valerius began, his tone softer now but no less serious. Are you unharmed? Lyra nodded, though she still looked shaken. Yes, headmaster. But my magic, it reacted strangely during the duel. It was like something inside me woke up, and I couldn't control it. She glanced at Elias. Until he stopped it. Valerius turned his gaze to Elias. And you, Elias. That command you used *Kaldoresh star. Where did you learn it? Elias kept his expression carefully blank. As I told Lyra, I read it in an old book in the library. I've always had an interest in obscure magical theory. Is that so? Valerius leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Because that particular phrase is not recorded in any accessible Academy texts. In fact, it only appears in forbidden archives, in records dating back to the Age of Shadows, specifically, in accounts of the demon king Zogaroth's reign. The name hung in the air like a physical weight. Elias felt his heart rate spike, but he forced himself to remain still. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Lyra stiffen, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. The Demon King? Lyra whispered. But that's ancient history. He was defeated millennia ago. Indeed, Valerius said, his eyes never leaving Elias. But his legacy lingers in certain, esoteric knowledge. Kaldoresh was a command used by Zogaroth's inner circle to control volatile magical energies. It is not something a first-year student, let alone an F rank, should know. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Elias, who are you? Elias met the headmaster's gaze. I am Elias Viridian, a student of the Arcane Academy. Nothing more. Valerius sighed, leaning back in his chair. I have been watching you, Elias. Since the dungeon incident, when you whispered another ancient incantation to weaken that mutated beast. Since your remedial lesson, where you dismantled a complex ward with ease. Since you corrected Kale's sword forms and guided Aria's fire control. Your knowledge is not that of a student. It is the knowledge of someone who has lived through eras of magic long forgotten. Lyra's eyes widened. You think he's, what? Some kind of ancient mage in disguise? Or something worse, Valerius said quietly. He reached into a drawer of his desk and pulled out a weathered scroll, unrolling it on the surface. It was a historical illustration, faded with age, depicting a towering figure clad in dark armor, surrounded by swirling shadows and kneeling generals. The caption beneath it read, Zogaroth, the Demon King, and his dark generals at the Battle of the Crimson Plains. Elias's breath caught. The image was stylized, but unmistakable. There he was, as he had been in his past life, a being of immense power and terror. And there, beside him, were figures that made his chest tighten: Ignis, with flames wreathed around her; Vorax, with a massive sword; Sana, with healing light that could also wither. His generals. His friends. You see, Valerius said, tapping the scroll. Historical records describe Zogaroth's magic as rooted in the old tongue, with commands that could bend reality itself. What you did today, Elias, matches those descriptions too closely to be coincidence. Lyra looked from the scroll to Elias, her face pale. But that's impossible. The Demon King was destroyed. And Elias is just. Elias. Is he? Valerius asked. Elias, I have done a background check on you. Your records are sparse and orphan with minimal magical aptitude, admitted on a charity scholarship. But there are gaps. Unexplained periods. And your sudden display of knowledge, it defies explanation unless you are not who you claim to be. Elias remained silent, his mind racing. Denial would only deepen suspicion. But confession could mean execution. He weighed his options, the legacy of Annihilation, providing him with millennia of strategic thinking. Valerius was not attacking, he was probing. That meant he had a reason to keep Elias alive. What do you want, headmaster? Elias asked finally, his voice steady. Valerius's lips curved into a thin smile. Direct. Good. I believe you are connected to Zogaroth in some way, perhaps a descendant, or a vessel of his knowledge. But I also believe you are not a threat to the Academy. At least, not intentionally. Why would you think that? Lyra interjected, her healer's compassion warring with her fear. Because, Valerius said, you have saved students multiple times. You corrected flaws in their training that could have gotten them killed. You stabilized Lyra's magic today, preventing a catastrophe. If you were truly a malevolent force, you would have let the arena explode. He leaned forward again, his expression earnest. Elias, I am not your enemy. But there is a greater threat looming, one that requires knowledge like yours. Elias felt a chill. What threat? Valerius's gaze turned grim. For months, I have been receiving reports of strange magical disturbances in the northern wastes. Ancient seals weakening. Creatures from the Age of Shadows stirring. And recently, whispers of a cult gathering, one that venerates the old demon empire and seeks to restore it. He paused. Their leader is said to be a figure named Malachar, who claims to have retained memories from the past. He is amassing power, and his sights are set on the Arcane Academy. Malachar. The name sent a surge of cold fury through Elias. In his past life, Malachar had been one of his generals, a cunning strategist who had betrayed him in the final days of the war, siding with the forces of light in exchange for power. If Malachar had retained his memories, he would be a formidable enemy, and he would know exactly who Elias was. Why tell me this? Elias asked, though he already suspected the answer. Because I believe you can help, Valerius said. Your knowledge of ancient magic, of Zogaroth's techniques, could be the key to countering Malachar. I am forming a covert squad to investigate and, if necessary, engage this threat. I want you to be part of it, to train them, guide them. Lyra stared in disbelief. Headmaster, you can't be serious. You're asking Elias to help based on what? A hunch that he knows dark magic? Based on the fact that he has already proven himself capable, Valerius replied. And based on the fact that we are running out of time. The Academy's defenses are not prepared for an assault from something like Malachar. We need every advantage we can get. He turned back to Elias. This is my offer, Elias. Help us against this coming threat. Train the squad I select, which will include Arya, Kale, and Lyra, given their unique potentials. In return, I will keep your secrets. I will not expose whatever connection you have to Zogaroth. But if you refuse... He let the sentence hang, the unspoken threat clear. Refusal would mean exposure, likely imprisonment or worse. Elias weighed the options. Working with Valerius meant stepping further into the light, risking his identity being discovered by his generals and the wider academy. But it also meant a chance to protect them, to guide Arya, Kale, and Lyra against a threat they were not ready to face. And it meant confronting Malachar, a traitor who deserved punishment. Elias looked at Lyra, who was watching him with a mix of fear and curiosity. He thought of Arya's uncontrolled flames, Kale's flawed sword forms, Lyra's corrupted healing. They were his generals, even if they didn't know it. And they were in danger. I'll do it, Elias said, his voice firm. But on one condition. The squad operates under my guidance. No questions about my methods or my knowledge. And you keep my involvement quiet, from the other teachers, from the student body. Only those directly involved need to know. Valerius nodded slowly. Agreed. The squad will be assembled discreetly. Training begins in 3 days, in the old practice grounds behind the North Tower. He stood, extending a hand. Do we have a deal? Elias rose and shook the headmaster's hand, the gesture feeling like a pact with fate itself. We do. As they turned to leave, Valerius added, Oh, and Elias? Malachar is not the only one with memories. If he learns you are here, he will come for you. Be prepared. The words echoed in Elias's mind as he and Lyra exited the office. In the hallway, Lyra stopped him, her expression troubled. Elias, what is really going on? She asked softly. That command, the way the headmaster talked about the Demon King, it's like there's a part of you that's not human. Elias met her eyes, seeing the ghost of Sana in her concern. Some truths are better left buried, Lyra. For now, just know that I will do everything I can to keep you all safe. He walked away, leaving her standing in the corridor, more questions than answers in her wake. As he descended the tower stairs, Elias felt the weight of his decision settle upon him. He had just agreed to train his former generals against a traitor from his past, all while hiding his true identity. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time since awakening in this weak body, he felt a sense of purpose. The Demon King might be gone, but Zogaroth's legacy was not yet finished. And somewhere in the northern wastes, Malachar was waiting. The heavy oak door of Headmaster Valerius's office clicked shut behind Elias, sealing him in a room that smelled of old parchment, polished wood, and the faint ozone tang of powerful magic. Moonlight streamed through the tall arched windows, casting long shadows across the shelves of ancient tomes and the intricate astrolabe that dominated one corner of the room. Valerius stood by the fireplace, his back to Elias, the flames dancing in reflection on his silver-trimmed robes. Elias remained standing just inside the door, his posture deliberately slack, the picture of a nervous F-rank student. Internally, his mind was a fortress of calculation. The headmaster had spoken the command Kaldoresh, a phrase from the demon tongue, one only Zogaroth and his inner circle should have known. It was the incantation Elias had whispered to quell Lyra's magic in the arena. To hear it from this man's lips was like a ghost from the abyss whispering in his ear. "Sit, Elias," Valerius said without turning, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "We have much to discuss, and little time for pretense." Elias moved to the high-back leather chair opposite the headmaster's desk, lowering himself into it with a careful slowness that belied the tension coiling in his muscles. The chair was too large for his slight frame, a physical reminder of his current weakness. He kept his eyes downcast, studying the intricate patterns in the Persian rug beneath his feet, a design that echoed the celestial maps of a bygone era. Valerius finally turned, his face illuminated by the firelight. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with sharp features and eyes that held the weight of decades of arcane study. But there was something else in those eyes now, a knowing glint that made Elias's ancient soul stir with caution. "You used Kaldoresh today," Valerius began, moving to stand behind his desk, his fingers tracing the edge of a heavy, leather-bound book. "A command of binding and suppression. It originates from the Third Age of Darkness, specifically from the lexicon of the Demon King Zogaroth's inner circle. It hasn't been spoken in recorded history for over 3 millennia. Elias kept his expression blank, though internally he was mapping every possible response. Denial? Feigned ignorance? The headmaster had clearly done his research. I don't know what that means, headmaster, Elias said, letting his voice waver slightly. The words came to me. I was trying to help Lyra. Valerius's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. Save the act, boy. I've been monitoring you since the dungeon incident. The way you dismantled Professor Thorne's barrier ward. The meditation technique you taught Arya that stabilized her core flames, a technique documented only in fragments from the Demon King's military archives. And today. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Elias's. Today, you spoke a dead language with the fluency of a native. You are not Elias Thorne, the magically inept orphan from the border villages. Who are you? Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Elias felt the weight of millennia pressing down on him. He could lie, could try to maintain the facade, but Valerius was no fool. The man had pieced together enough to be dangerous. And there was something in his demeanor, not hostility, but a grim urgency. Elias let the mask slip, just a fraction. The nervous slump of his shoulders straightened, and his eyes, which had been carefully dull, sharpened with an intensity that didn't belong to a teenager. What do you want, headmaster? He asked, his voice dropping into a lower, steadier register. Valerius didn't flinch. If anything, he looked relieved. Straight to the point. Good. I am not your enemy, Elias, or whatever your true name is. But we have a common problem. A threat is gathering in the shadows, one that targets this academy specifically. And I believe you are uniquely positioned to understand it. He opened the book on his desk, revealing pages filled with dense, spidery script and illustrations of sigils that made Elias's blood run cold. They were symbols of the old demon empire, the same empire he had ruled. For months, we've detected anomalous magical signatures in the wilderness beyond the academy grounds, Valerius explained, pointing to a map dotted with red marks. Residues of corruption, summoning circles that shouldn't exist, and sightings of creatures thought extinct since the fall of Zogaroth. Our scouts have identified a leader, a figure who calls himself Malachar. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Malachar. His former general of the Shadow Legion, a master of subterfuge and psychic warfare. In the final days of his reign, Malachar had betrayed him, leaking battle plans to the coalition of heroes that led to Zogaroth's defeat. Elias had always suspected Malachar's ambition had outweighed his loyalty, but he'd never had proof before the end came. To hear that name now, in this context. Malachar, Elias repeated, the word tasting like ash on his tongue. He was a general. In the old wars. More than that, Valerius said, watching Elias closely. According to the fragments we've recovered, Malachar was one of Zogaroth's most trusted commanders until his betrayal. He vanished after the Demon King's fall, presumed dead. But now he's returned, and he's not alone. He's gathering remnants of the old empire, beings who, like him, seem to have retained memories of their past lives. Their target is this academy. They believe something here holds the key to restoring the demon empire's power. Elias's mind raced. Malachar, alive and remembering. It made a terrible kind of sense. If Elias's own soul had persisted through reincarnation, why not others? And Malachar had always been cunning, always playing the long game. But why the academy? What could possibly be here that? Then it struck him. The leyline nexus. The academy was built atop one of the world's most potent magical convergences. In his past life, Zogaroth had sought to claim such nexuses to fuel his apocalyptic rituals. If Malachar could tap into this one, he could unleash untold devastation, or perhaps even attempt a full-scale resurrection of the Empire. He's after the nexus, Elias said quietly, more to himself than to Valerius. The headmaster's eyes widened slightly. You know of it? That information is classified to the highest levels of the faculty. I know many things I shouldn't, Elias replied, his gaze distant. Malachar won't attack head-on. He'll use proxies, create diversions, weaken your defenses from within before striking at the heart. He always preferred subtlety to brute force. Valerius nodded slowly. Our conventional defenses are ill-suited to such tactics. Our teachers are experts in modern combat magic, but they have no experience with the kind of warfare Malachar will wage. And our top students. He paused, his expression turning thoughtful. Arya, Kale, Lyra. They're powerful, but they're untested against true, existential threats. They train for tournaments and dungeon crawls, not for battles that could decide the fate of nations. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. His generals. They were here, in this academy, unaware of their pasts. And now they were being drawn into a conflict with a traitor from that past. The irony was almost painful. What do you propose? Elias asked, though he already suspected the answer. I want you to train them, Valerius said bluntly. A covert squad, operating outside the standard curriculum. You'll teach them what they need to survive what's coming. Your knowledge of Malachar's tactics, of the old magic, of the weaknesses in their current training, it could make the difference. Elias stared at him. You're asking the Demon King to train heroes to fight his own former general. I'm asking someone with the knowledge to save this academy, Valerius corrected. Your past is just that, past. What matters is the present threat. Help me, and I will keep your secret. Refuse, and I will have no choice but to reveal what I know to the council. They will see you as a threat to be contained, if not eliminated. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum wrapped in the guise of cooperation. But Elias saw the logic in it. This was a chance to protect his generals, to guide them against a threat they weren't prepared for. And perhaps, in doing so, he could atone for some fraction of the destruction he'd wrought in his past life. He thought of Arya, her fire magic awakening to echoes of her past as Ignis. Of Kale, whose sword forms carried the ghost of Vorax's brutality. Of Lyra, whose healing touch now brushed against the corruption of her former self. They were his responsibility, whether they knew it or not. "I'll do it," Elias said, the words feeling heavy with consequence. "But on my terms. No interference from the faculty. I choose the training methods, the location, the schedule. And they are not to know who I am. To them, I'm just an F-rank student you've assigned to help for reasons they don't need to understand." Valerius considered this, then gave a slow nod. "Agreed. The old observatory on the North Cliffs. It's been disused for years, but the wards are still strong. I'll have it prepared. You'll meet them there tomorrow at dusk." He extended a hand across the desk. After a moment's hesitation, Elias took it. The headmaster's grip was firm, his palm calloused from decades of spellcasting. "Do not make me regret this, Elias," Valerius said softly. "The lives of everyone in this academy may depend on what you teach them." The next evening found Elias making his way along the winding path that led to the northern cliffs. The sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and distant sea salt. The observatory loomed ahead, a circular stone structure perched precariously on the edge of the cliffs, its domed roof silhouetted against the darkening sky. Elias pushed open the heavy iron-banded door, stepping into a space that was both familiar and alien. The main chamber was vast, with a high ceiling supported by stone arches. In the center, where a telescope might once have stood, was now a clear space, the floor inscribed with fresh chalk circles and runes, preparations Valerius had made. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty volumes, and a few work tables held an assortment of training dummies, practice weapons, and crystal foci. Arya, Kale, and Lyra were already there, standing in a loose cluster near one of the tables. They turned as he entered, their expressions a mix of confusion, skepticism, and curiosity. "Elias?" Arya said, her brow furrowed. "What are you doing here?" "Headmaster Valerius said we were meeting a special instructor for some kind of advanced training squad." Kale crossed his arms, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Yeah, he was pretty vague about the details. Just said it was urgent and classified. But you..." He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "You're not the instructor, are you?" Lyra said nothing, but her eyes were fixed on Elias with an intensity that made him uneasy. Since the tournament, she'd been watching him, her healing senses no doubt picking up on the dissonance in his soul. Elias took a deep breath, stepping further into the room. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud, sealing them in. "I am the instructor," he said, keeping his voice level. "Headmaster Valerius has assigned me to train you." Silence followed his words, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. Arya blinked. "You? But you're..." She stopped herself, but the unspoken words hung in the air. Asterisk, you're F rank. You're the weakest student in the academy, asterisk. Kale let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "This is a joke, right? Some kind of test?" "Elias, no offense, but you can barely cast a basic light spell. How are you supposed to train us?" Lyra finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "He stopped my magic in the arena." With a word no one else recognized. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Elias's face. "Who are you, really?" Elias met her gaze, feeling the weight of their suspicion like a physical pressure. This was the moment, the first step on a path that could lead to his exposure or their salvation. He had to walk it carefully. "The headmaster believes there's a threat coming to the academy," Elias said, ignoring Lyra's question for now. "A threat that your current training hasn't prepared you for. He's tasked me with rectifying that." "What threat?" Kale demanded. "And why you? What do you know that the teachers don't?" "More than you can imagine," Elias replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But for now, all you need to know is this: the training will be harsh. It will challenge everything you think you know about magic and combat. You will fail, repeatedly. And you will either adapt, or you will be useless when the danger arrives." He moved to the center of the room, standing within the largest chalk circle. Your first lesson starts now. Arya, attack me. Arya stared at him. What? Elias, I could incinerate you by accident. You won't, Elias said, his voice calm. Because your control is flawed. You rely too much on raw power and not enough on precision. Show me your strongest firebolt. Arya hesitated, glancing at Kale and Lyra. Kale gave a slight shrug, his expression still skeptical but now tinged with curiosity. Lyra nodded slowly, as if giving permission. With a sigh, Arya raised her hand. Flames coalesced around her fingers, swirling into a compact sphere of intense heat. The air in the observatory grew warm, and the light from her magic cast flickering shadows on the walls. With a sharp motion, she hurled the firebolt at Elias. Elias didn't move. He didn't raise a hand to defend himself. He simply watched the projectile arc toward him, his mind analyzing its trajectory, its magical composition, the subtle imbalances in its structure. At the last possible moment, he spoke a single syllable in the demon tongue, a word of dispersion. The firebolt didn't strike him. Instead, it unraveled midair, the flames dissipating into harmless sparks that faded before they reached him. Arya's jaw dropped. Kale straightened, his eyes wide. Lyra inhaled sharply. How? Arya whispered. Your spell had 7 points of instability, Elias said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. The mana flow was turbulent at the 3rd and 5th nodal points. The containment matrix was overcharged by 12%, wasting energy and reducing accuracy. And your release timing was off by a quarter second, giving me ample opportunity to counter. He stepped out of the circle, approaching Arya. Modern fire magic emphasizes power over efficiency. It's like trying to put out a candle with a tidal wave. What I will teach you is how to make that candle go out with a whisper. He turned to Kale. Your turn. Draw your sword and strike me. Kale's hand went to the hilt of the practice blade at his waist. Elias, I don't want to hurt you. You won't, Elias said again. Because your form is predictable. You telegraph your movements in the set of your shoulders and the shift of your weight. Attack. Kale's expression hardened. He drew the sword in a smooth motion, stepping forward with a practiced lunge aimed at Elias's chest. It was fast, precise, the move of a top-ranked swordsman. Elias didn't dodge. He shifted his weight slightly, turning his body at an angle that made Kale's blade pass harmlessly by his side. At the same moment, his hand shot out, fingers pressing against a specific point on Kale's wrist. A nerve cluster, one Elias had exploited in 1,000 battles. Kale's grip spasmed, and the sword clattered to the stone floor. He stared at his empty hand, then at Elias, his face a mask of shock. You overextended by 3 inches, Elias said, his voice clinical. Your center of gravity was too far forward, leaving you vulnerable to a simple redirection. And you focused entirely on the strike, ignoring the possibility of a counterattack to your weapon arm. He picked up the sword, handing it back to Kale. What I will teach you is how to fight without fighting. How to make your opponent defeat themselves. Finally, he turned to Lyra. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Lyra, your magic is healing, but it has offensive potential you don't understand, Elias said. In the arena, it nearly destroyed you and everyone around you. That wasn't an accident. It was a manifestation of power you can't control because you don't know its source. Lyra's eyes narrowed. And you do? I know enough to help you harness it without it consuming you, Elias replied. But that lesson is for another day. For now, observe. He walked back to the center of the room, facing all 3 of them. The threat coming to this academy won't fight fair. It won't follow the rules of tournaments or classroom duels. It will use every dirty trick, every weakness, every moment of hesitation. And if you're not prepared, you will die. All of you. His words hung in the air, stark and uncompromising. Starting tomorrow, we meet here every evening after classes, Elias continued. You will learn advanced combat theory, magical efficiency, tactical improvisation, and things that aren't in any textbook in this academy. You will push yourselves beyond what you think are your limits. And you will do it because the alternative is failure on a scale you can't comprehend. He looked at each of them in turn. Arya, still reeling from the dismantling of her firebolt, Kale, rubbing his wrist where Elias had struck, Lyra, her expression thoughtful and troubled. Do you understand? Elias asked. There was a long pause. Then Arya nodded slowly. I understand. Kale sheathed his practice sword, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grim determination. Yeah. I'm in. Lyra was the last to respond. She studied Elias for another moment, then gave a single, slow nod. As am I. Elias felt a strange mix of relief and dread. They had agreed, but they were still unaware of who he truly was. How long could he keep that secret? And what would happen when they inevitably discovered the truth? Good, he said, pushing the thoughts aside. We begin in earnest tomorrow. For now, dismissed. They filed out of the observatory, each lost in their own thoughts. Elias watched them go, their figures disappearing into the twilight. When they were gone, he let out a long, slow breath, leaning against one of the stone pillars. Malachar was out there, gathering his forces. His generals were here, untrained and unaware. And he, the Demon King Reborn, was caught between them, a secret that could shatter everything. The training would be the easy part. The hard part would be keeping his past from consuming his present. The old observatory's training hall smelled of dust, ancient stone, and the faint ozone tang of recently discharged magic. Morning light filtered through high, arched windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like forgotten spirits. Elias stood before Arya, Kale, and Lyra, his posture deceptively relaxed. 3 days had passed since their first meeting here, and the initial skepticism in their eyes had hardened into wary curiosity. Today, Elias began, his voice calm but carrying an authority that belied his F-rank status. We move beyond basic drills. The Academy teaches you to treat magic as separate disciplines: fire, healing, swordsmanship. But in true combat, especially against what's coming, those divisions are fatal. Kale shifted his weight, his hand resting on the pommel of his practice sword. And what exactly is coming? Valerius was vague. A threat that doesn't care about your rank or titles, Elias replied, meeting each of their gazes. One that exploits gaps in your understanding. Arya, demonstrate your standard firebolt sequence. Arya stepped forward, her crimson robes whispering against the stone floor. She took a breath, her fingers weaving through the air. Flames coalesced into a bolt that shot across the room and struck a training dummy with a satisfying whoosh. The dummy charred, but remained standing. Adequate for classroom sparring, Elias said, walking toward the dummy. He placed a hand on its shoulder. But look here. He pointed to the uneven burn patterns. Your focus is on power output, not precision. You're wasting mana on flash over function. In the old texts I've studied, fire mages learn to compress their flames, to make them burn hotter in a smaller area. Arya's brow furrowed. Compress? That's advanced theory, third-year curriculum. And yet necessary now. Elias gestured for her to try again. Don't think of fire as an element to be unleashed. Think of it as a blade you're sharpening. As Arya concentrated, her flames flickered uncertainly. Elias moved beside her, his voice dropping to a murmur only she could hear. Remember the Forge of Ignis Peak? How the flames there didn't roar, they sang. Arya's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't heard those words before, yet something in her chest tightened, a vague memory of heat and purpose. Her next firebolt was smaller, a concentrated spear of blue-tinged flame that punched clean through the dummy's chest, leaving a neat, smoldering hole. Kale whistled lowly. Since when can you do that? I don't know, Arya admitted, staring at her hands. It felt familiar. Elias turned to Kale. Your turn. Show me your defensive stance against a magical projectile. Kale assumed his stance, feet planted, sword raised to deflect. Elias nodded slowly. Good form. But you're anticipating a direct attack. What if the projectile curves? Before Kale could respond, Elias flicked his wrist. A pebble, enchanted with a faint glimmer of mana, arced through the air not toward Kale, but toward the wall behind him, ricocheting at an angle to strike his unprotected side. Kale stumbled, caught off guard. That's cheating. No, Elias said, his tone edged with the patience of millennia. That's warfare. Your enemy won't fight by Academy rules. Your muscle memory is trained for duels, not survival. Let me show you. He picked up a practice sword, its weight unfamiliar in his weak grip, but his movements were fluid, economical. He demonstrated a series of parries and footwork adjustments, each motion designed to minimize exposure to unpredictable attacks. As Kale mimicked him, something stirred in the swordsman's mind, a phantom ache in his shoulders, the echo of a battle cry in a language he shouldn't know. He executed a particularly complex maneuver flawlessly, then froze, breathing heavily. How did I? Kale muttered, looking at Elias with dawning suspicion. That move, it's not in any manual. Elias met his gaze evenly. Perhaps it's in your blood. Lyra, who had been observing quietly, her healing staff glowing softly in her hands, stepped forward. This is unsettling. You're teaching us things that feel instinctive. Like we've done them before in dreams. Dreams can be memories in disguise, Elias said, turning to her. Your healing magic, you rely on direct mending. But what if the injury is cursed, or the mana flow is corrupted? He produced a small, withered plant from his pocket, its leaves blackened as if by blight. Simulate a healing on this. Use your standard technique. Lyra channeled her magic, a gentle green light enveloping the plant. The blackness receded slightly, but then spread anew, worse than before. She frowned. It's resisting. Because you're treating the symptom, not the source, Elias explained. This blight is magical in nature, a mimic of the corruption we might face. Try listening to the mana pattern, not just overriding it. As Lyra focused, her magic brushing against the plant's aura, a sudden jolt went through her. Images flashed behind her eyes, a dark castle with obsidian spires, a throne room filled with shadows, and a figure seated there, radiating power that made her soul tremble. She gasped, dropping the plant, her staff clattering to the floor. Lyra! Arya rushed to her side, but Lyra waved her off, her face pale. I'm fine, she whispered, though her hands shook. Just a headache. Elias watched her closely, his expression unreadable. We'll break for now. Rest. We resume at dusk for night maneuvers. As Arya and Kale left, discussing the strange familiarity of the techniques, Lyra lingered. She waited until their footsteps faded, then turned to Elias, her eyes sharp with accusation. What was that? She demanded, her voice low. Those visions, they weren't random. They felt ancient, and they came when I touched your magic. Even that pebble you threw had a trace of it, something dark and old. Elias sighed, leaning against a stone pillar. The observatory was silent save for the distant caw of a crow. Sit, Lyra. She remained standing, her arms crossed. Explain. What do you know of reincarnation? He asked, his gaze distant. Fairy tales. Myths used to comfort children about death. And yet, here we are, Elias said softly. You, Arya, Kale, and me. Our souls have lived before. Fought before. Died before. Lyra's breath hitched. You're saying we knew each other? In past lives? More than knew. Elias met her eyes, and for a moment, the meek F-rank student vanished, replaced by a presence that seemed to fill the room with invisible weight. We were bound by oath and blood. You were my healer, my strategist. Arya was my fury, Kale my shield. And I. He paused, the words hanging in the air like a blade about to fall. Lyra's magic, always attuned to the truth of things, reacted violently. Her healing aura flared, not with light, but with a deep, resonant pulse that made the dust on the floor vibrate. The vision returned, the dark castle, the throne, and now she saw the figure clearly, a crown of shadows, eyes burning with apocalyptic knowledge, a hand extended not in malice, but in command. You were our king, Lyra whispered, the horror dawning slowly, then all at once. Her mind recoiled, scrambling to reconcile the bullied student before her with the sovereign of her visions. The Demon King Zogaroth, a name from history books, a monster used to scare novices into respecting magical ethics. No. It can't be. You're Elias, the F rank, the trash. I am both, Elias said, his voice weary. Zogaroth was defeated, his empire shattered. I awoke in this body, with all his memories, all his knowledge, the legacy of annihilation, as the texts call it. But I am not him, not entirely. This life, this academy, it's a chance to do things differently. Lyra stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The pieces clicked into place, his uncanny insights, the ancient techniques, the way he looked at them with a mixture of fondness and regret. All this time, you've been lying to us. We thought we were helping a weakling, but you are. I am trying to protect you, Elias insisted, taking a step forward, but Lyra retreated further, her back hitting the cold stone wall. Malachar, the threat Valerius spoke of, he was a traitor in our past life. He remembers, and he's coming. The Academy's methods will get you killed. I had to guide you, even if it meant hiding this. Lyra's mind raced. Betrayal warred with the strange, deep-seated loyalty that had made her defend him to Arya and Kael before. Her healing magic, which always sought truth and wholeness, recoiled from the darkness of his past, yet resonated with the sincerity in his eyes now. She saw not a monster, but a tired soul carrying a burden no one should bear. Arya and Kael, do they know? She asked, her voice trembling. Not yet. They feel echoes, as you did. But the full truth. I feared how they'd react. Lyra closed her eyes, the image of the dark throne burning behind her lids. When she opened them, tears glistened at the corners. You were the Demon King. The destroyer of nations. And we served you. You were my family, Elias said, and there was a raw pain in those words that cut through Lyra's horror. And in this life, I would see you live, even if it means you despise me. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by Lyra's shaky breaths. Then, slowly, she straightened, wiping her tears. Her healer's instincts, always to mend and understand, warred with her shock. Valerius knows, doesn't he? That's why he put you in charge. Elias nodded. He offered me a choice, help stop Malachar, or be exposed. I chose to help. For you. For all of you. Lyra's gaze hardened, but not with hatred, with a dawning, terrible resolve. If what you say is true, then Malachar is a danger beyond anything this academy has faced. And you're the only one who can stop him. She took a deep breath. I won't tell Arya and Kael. Not yet. They're not ready. But when the time comes, you have to be the one to tell them. And you have to be prepared for them to turn on you. Elias bowed his head. Thank you, Lyra. Don't thank me, she said, her voice firming. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because whatever we were in the past, we're allies now, and Malachar is the enemy. But understand this, if you betray us, if you become the monster from my visions, I will heal every wound you've ever suffered just so I can hurt you anew. With that, she turned and walked away, her steps echoing in the hollow hall. Elias watched her go, the weight of his secret now shared, and heavier than ever. Dusk approached, painting the windows in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a storm gathered, and with it, the shadow of Malachar's advance. The training was far from over, but the real battle, for trust, for redemption, had just begun. The moon hung like a pale sickle over the Arcane Academy's training grounds, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe with memories. Lyra stood at the edge of the forest clearing, her hands trembling as she recounted her conversation with Elias to Arya and Kael. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing between them. He said we have past lives together, Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. That he remembers things about us. And when I touched his magic during the healing exercise, I saw it. A dark castle, a throne of obsidian, and him sitting there with eyes that burned like dying stars. Arya crossed her arms, the embers in her hair glowing faintly in the darkness. That's ridiculous, Lyra. Elias is an F-rank student who somehow knows a few tricks. Past lives? Demon kings? You've been studying too much forbidden lore. Is it really so unbelievable? Kale's voice was uncharacteristically quiet. He leaned against a tree, his sword hand resting on the pommel of his blade. Think about it. The way he corrected my stance in combat class, it wasn't just knowledge. It was muscle memory. And when he disarmed me in the library, I felt like I'd seen that move before, in a dream or a nightmare I can't quite recall. Aria's flames flickered with her agitation. So what? He's weirdly good at pointing out flaws. That doesn't make him some reincarnated tyrant. It's more than that, Lyra insisted, her healing magic tingling at her fingertips as if reacting to the memory. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said, we were different people in a different time. And his eyes, they looked ancient, Arya. Older than the Academy, older than any human should be. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Kale pushed off from the tree, his expression grim. There's one way to find out. Elias practices alone every night in the abandoned observatory. If he's hiding something, that's where we'll see it. Arya hesitated, the logical part of her mind screaming that this was invasion of privacy, madness. But the part that remembered uncontrollable flames and Elias's calm guidance and the dorm fire, that part was curious. Fine, she said finally. But if he's just a weird kid with a talent for old magic, we leave him alone. Agreed? Lyra and Kale nodded, though neither looked convinced. The abandoned observatory stood on the Academy's northern cliffs, a relic from a time when astronomers studied stars rather than mana flows. Its dome was cracked, letting in slivers of moonlight that painted silver stripes across the dusty floor. Elias stood in the center of the room, his breathing steady as he focused. For weeks, he'd been careful. Too careful. Hiding his true nature behind layers of deception, speaking in half-truths, guiding his generals with subtle nudges rather than commands. But the weight of the legacy of Annihilation pressed against his mind, millennia of knowledge, battles fought and won, empires risen and fallen. And now, with Malakar's threat looming, he needed to reclaim just a fraction of his former power, if only to ensure he could protect them. Let the shadows remember, he murmured, the words in the ancient tongue of the demon courts. It was a language of sharp consonants and guttural vowels, one that hadn't been spoken in this world for centuries. At first, nothing happened. Then the moonlight in the room seemed to darken, coalescing into tendrils of shadow that swirled around his feet. Elias closed his eyes, reaching into the depths of his soul where Zogaroth's memory slept. He pictured the throne room of his fortress, the Black Spire, where his generals had knelt before him, their loyalty as unshakable as the mountains. Manifest, he commanded. The shadows responded. They rose from the floor, twisting and shaping themselves into a form that grew more solid with every passing second. First came the outline of a massive throne, carved from what appeared to be solidified darkness. Then figures began to appear around it, shadowy silhouettes of armored warriors, their features indistinct but their stances proud and fierce. One held a sword that seemed to drink the light, another had flames dancing at her fingertips, a third glowed with a soft, healing radiance. Elias's breath caught. He hadn't meant to summon this much. The construct was a memory-given form, a piece of his past made manifest through will and ancient magic. And at its center, seated on the shadow throne, was a figure that mirrored his own, but taller, broader, crowned with horns of darkness and eyes that glowed with crimson light. Zogaroth, the demon king, as he had been in his prime. From their hiding place behind a collapsed bookshelf, Arya, Kale, and Lyra watched with mounting horror. By the founders, Arya breathed, her flames guttering out in shock. That's impossible. Kale's hand went to his sword, his knuckles white. The shadow warrior with the blade, it moved with a familiar grace, a stance he'd found himself falling into during training without knowing why. And the fiery figure, he glanced at Arya, saw her staring at the shadow flames with a recognition that went beyond intellect. Lyra was trembling. The healing glow from the third shadow was identical to the magic that had given her visions. It's true, she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. All of it. We were there. We served him. Elias, sensing their presence too late, let the construct dissolve. The shadows retreated, flowing back into the corners of the room as if they'd never been. But the damage was done. He turned slowly, his face pale in the returning moonlight. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice flat. Arya stepped out first, her usual confidence replaced by a wary tension. "What was that, Elias? Or should I call you something else?" Kale emerged beside her, his sword still sheathed but his posture ready for combat. "Explain. Now." Lyra hung back, her hands clasped together as if praying. "You said we had past lives. You didn't say you were him." Elias looked at each of them, Arya with her defiant flames, Kale with his soldier's discipline, Lyra with her healer's compassion. They were so young, so human. And yet, beneath the surface, he could still see Ignis, Vorax, and Seraphina, his most trusted generals. The ones who had stood by him until the end. "My name is Elias," he began, choosing his words with care. "But once, millennia ago, I was known as Zogaroth, Lord of the Black Spire, King of the Demon Realms." The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. Arya's fire flared, then died back as she struggled for control. The Demon King? The one who nearly destroyed the world? That's a children's tale, a warning story told to scare mages into behaving. It's history, Elias corrected gently. And like all history, it's more complicated than the stories. I was defeated, my empire shattered, my soul scattered. I don't know how or why I've returned in this body, with these memories. But I have. Kale took a step forward, his eyes narrowed. And us? Lyra said we were there. In your court. Elias met his gaze, seeing the conflict there, the loyalty warring with betrayal. You were my generals. My friends. Arya, you were Ignis, master of the Infernal Legions. Kale, you were Vorax, blade of the Eternal Vanguard. Lyra, you were Seraphina, keeper of the Soulforge. He paused, letting the names settle. You were the best of me. The parts that remembered honor, even in darkness. Lyra made a small, choked sound. You killed thousands. The histories say you razed cities, enslaved nations. I did, Elias admitted, no trace of evasion in his voice. And I have to live with that. But the man who did those things died on the battlefield centuries ago. I'm not him. Not entirely. I have his memories, his knowledge, but I'm also Elias, the student who gets bullied for being weak, who cares about this academy, who wants to protect you. Arya's fists clenched. Why didn't you tell us? All this time, training us, guiding us, you were manipulating us. I was trying to keep you alive. The words burst from Elias with more emotion than he'd intended. The magic they teach here is flawed. Primitive. It would get you killed against a real threat. And now Malachar is coming, a general from my past who remembers everything, who wants to finish what we started. I couldn't risk telling you the truth until you were ready. Until I knew you'd believe me. Kale's sword hand twitched. And what if we don't believe you now? What if we decide you're still the monster from the stories? Elias spread his hands, a gesture of surrender. Then do what you have to do. But know this: everything I've done since waking up in this body has been to protect this place, and you. The dungeon beast, the tournament, the training, it was all for that. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Lyra looked from Elias to the others, her healer's mind racing. She remembered the visions, the throne, yes, but also moments of laughter in the war camps, of shared meals after battles, of a loyalty that went deeper than fear. When you helped me control my magic, she said slowly, when you saved Arya from her flames, when you showed Kale how to improve, was that manipulation? Or was it because you actually care? Elias's shoulders slumped. I care. More than I should. In my past life, I saw you as tools, as extensions of my will. But now, you're students. You're young. You have choices. And if I've learned anything from this second chance, it's that loyalty earned is stronger than loyalty demanded. Arya's flames finally settled into a steady, warm glow. The dorm fire, she said. You could have let me burn myself out. Instead, you risked exposure to help me. Why? Because you were my general, Elias said softly. But also because you're Arya. And I couldn't watch you get hurt. Kale stared at him for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, drew his sword. The steel gleamed in the moonlight, pointed not at Elias, but at the ground between them. His face was a mask of conflict, betrayal warring with familiarity, fear wrestling with a strange, deep-seated urge to kneel. I don't know what to believe, Kale said, his voice rough. Part of me wants to cut you down where you stand for lying to us. Part of me remembers something. A battle cry, a standard with your sigil, standing at your side as the world burned. He shook his head, the sword trembling in his hand. Who are you, really? The demon king who destroyed nations, or the F-rank student who's been helping us? Elias held his gaze, his own hands at his sides, making no move to defend himself. I'm both. And I'm neither. I'm someone trying to do better this time. He took a step forward, ignoring the sword. Malachar is coming. He'll destroy this academy, kill everyone in it, and use their souls to fuel his return to power. I need your help to stop him. Not as my subjects, but as my allies. Will you stand with me? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Kale's sword remained poised, caught between attack and allegiance. Arya's flames flickered with uncertainty. Lyra's healing magic hummed with tension. And Elias waited, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. The silence in the abandoned observatory was thick enough to choke on. Kale's sword hovered between them, its tip trembling with the weight of millennia. Across from him, Elias stood motionless, his expression unreadable in the dim light filtering through cracked windows. To his left, Arya's hands were clenched, small flames dancing nervously at her fingertips, a subconscious echo of her past as Ignis. Lyra stood slightly apart, her healing magic pulsing erratically, casting ghostly green shadows that seemed to writhe with half-remembered nightmares. Zogaroth, Kale whispered the name like a curse, his knuckles white around the hilt. All this time, you were him. Elias didn't flinch. I am still Elias. The boy you pitted. The F-rank trash. His voice was calm, but there was an ancient weariness beneath it. But yes. I carry his memories. His knowledge. His regrets. Before anyone could respond, the first explosion rocked the academy. It started as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the mountains. Then the observatory windows shattered inward, showering them with glass. A second blast followed, closer this time, and the floor buckled beneath their feet. Screams echoed from the courtyard below, sharp and panicked. What in the hell's Arya began, but Elias was already moving. He crossed to the broken window in 3 quick strides, his movements suddenly fluid and precise, utterly unlike the clumsy student they knew. Below, chaos reigned. The academy's main gates were a twisted ruin of molten metal and stone. Dark shapes poured through the breach, creatures of shadow and jagged bone, their forms shifting like smoke. Students ran in every direction, their defensive spells flickering and failing against the onslaught. Teachers shouted orders that went unheeded, their barrier wards collapsing under concentrated assault. Malachar, Elias said, the name dropping like a stone. He's early. Lyra joined him at the window, her healer's instincts overriding her shock. There are wounded down there. We have to help. Help? Kale's sword finally lowered, but his eyes remained fixed on Elias. With him? He's the reason they're here. Another explosion, this one from the library tower. Flames licked at ancient manuscripts, sending plumes of magical residue spiraling into the sky. Through the smoke, Elias could see the attacker's formation, a classic pincer maneuver he'd taught Malachar himself 3,000 years ago. They were targeting the mana conduits first, cutting off the academy's power supply. Efficient. Brutal. Exactly as he would have done. Listen to me, Elias turned from the window, his gaze sweeping over them. In that moment, something shifted in his posture. The slouch was gone. The hesitant shuffle replaced by a commander's stance. You can hate me later. You can kill me later if you wish. But right now, those creatures down there will slaughter everyone in this academy unless we stop them. Aria's flames flared brighter. We? You expect us to fight alongside you after? I expect you to remember who you are, Elias cut her off, his voice sharp. Not the students you pretend to be. Not the heroes this academy wants you to be. You were my generals. You commanded legions. You held the line against the celestial host when the sky itself was falling. He stepped closer, and for the first time, they saw it, the ghost of something terrible in his eyes. A depth of experience no teenager should possess. Look at their formation. They're using the triangulation assault pattern. You know it, Vorax. You invented the counter. Kale stiffened. The name, his old name, struck something deep. A flash of memory, standing on a blood-soaked plain, shouting orders as winged horrors descended. He shook his head, trying to clear it. I don't. You do, Elias insisted. In your bones. In your soul. They're weak against coordinated flanking strikes because their shadow forms can't maintain cohesion under multi-directional pressure. Sound familiar? It did. Kale didn't know how, but it did. The knowledge was there, buried beneath layers of reincarnation, waiting. Lyra was already moving toward the door, her healer's satchel materializing from a pocket dimension. The infirmary will be overwhelmed. If we can establish a triage point. No, Elias said. The infirmary is a trap. Malachar knows standard defense protocols. He'll have units waiting to ambush anyone trying to secure medical facilities. He pointed toward the central courtyard. There. The old summoning circle. It's built on a ley line nexus. Your healing magic will be amplified tenfold, Lyra. You can create a barrier that purifies corruption as it heals. How do you know that? Lyra asked, but even as she spoke, her magic was already reaching out, sensing the ley lines Elias described. He was right. The energy there was familiar. Because I designed this academy's original layout, Elias said quietly. Before it was an academy. When it was my forward command post. Another explosion, closer. The door to the observatory blew inward, and two shadow creatures slithered through. They were nightmares given form, all teeth and claws and whispering darkness. Aria reacted first, a jet of white-hot flame erupting from her hands. It struck the lead creature, which screamed a sound like breaking glass, but didn't fall. Instead, it split into three smaller forms, each just as deadly. Don't use pure elemental attacks. Elias barked. Their nature is entropy. They feed on ordered energy. Aria, remember the Frostfire Cascade? The one you used at the Battle of Shattered Peaks? Aria froze. The memory came unbidden, standing on a glacier, her flames turning blue with cold as she incinerated an army of ice wraiths. Without thinking, she adjusted her stance, weaving her hands in a pattern she'd never been taught. The flames around her shifted from orange to cerulean blue, the air cracking with sudden frost. When she released the spell, it didn't just burn the shadow creatures, it unraveled them, their forms dissolving into mist that then froze and shattered. The remaining creature lunged at Kale. He brought his sword up automatically, but his form was wrong, the Academy's textbook stance, all flash and no substance. Elias saw the opening immediately. Low guard. Now. Kale dropped his stance, the movement awkward at first. The shadow creature's claws passed over his head, missing by inches. Now thrust upward, angled 15 degrees left. It's mimicking a drake's lunge, weak point is the third joint. Kale obeyed. His blade found purchase in something that felt like solidified smoke. The creature shrieked and dissolved. He stared at his sword, then at Elias. How did you? I've seen you kill 1,000 such creatures, Elias said, already turning back to the window. Now listen. We don't have time for revelations. Malachar's forces are executing a standard siege pattern. They've taken the gates, they're suppressing the faculty with anti-magic units, and they're herding students toward the central plaza for a mass sacrifice. Below, the chaos was organizing itself into the exact pattern Elias described. Teachers were being pushed back by creatures that shimmered with negation fields, their spells fizzling on contact. Students were indeed being corralled toward the plaza, where a dark altar was already forming from coalescing shadows. Lyra's face paled. Sacrifice? To what? To open a permanent gate to the Shadow Realms, Elias said. Malachar wants to reclaim my old throne. He needs a power source. A few hundred young mages should do nicely. Arya grabbed Elias's arm, her fingers hot enough to burn ordinary skin. He didn't flinch. You brought this here. Your past. Your war. Yes, Elias met her gaze. And I'm the only one who can end it. But I can't do it alone. Not in this body. He looked at each of them in turn. I need my generals. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sounds of battle filled the silence, screams, explosions, the eerie whispers of shadow creatures. Kale looked from his sword to the chaos below, then to Elias. The betrayal still burned in his chest, hot and bitter. But beneath it, something else. A pull. A recognition. When he'd disarmed Kale in the library, when he'd corrected his forms in class, it hadn't been luck. It had been memory. Their memory. What are your orders? Kale asked, the words tasting strange in his mouth. Elias didn't smile, but something in his shoulders relaxed. Arya, you take the eastern flank. There's a cluster of fire mages trying to hold the dormitories. They're using concentrated blasts inefficient against shadows. Teach them dispersion patterns. Wide area suppression. You remember. Arya nodded slowly. The knowledge was there, rising like a tide. She could already see the tactical layout in her mind, where the choke points were, where to place her people for maximum effect. Lyra, the summoning circle. Set up your triage there. Use the ley lines to create a purification field. Anything that crosses it will be weakened. And, he hesitated. Your healing has offensive applications you haven't remembered yet. Life magic can be inverted. To drain. To wither. Use it only as a last resort. Lyra's eyes widened. She'd felt that potential, the dark edge to her power that frightened her. Elias was giving her permission to embrace it. Kale, with me. We're taking the western approach. Malachar will have his lieutenants guarding the ritual site. They'll be in physical form, retain more of their memories, more of their power. We need to break their line before the sacrifice begins. And what about you? Arya asked. What can an F-rank do against lieutenants? Elias finally smiled, a thin, dangerous expression. I'm going to remind them who their king is. They moved. Arya went first, leaping from the observatory window not with a mage's careful levitation, but with a jet of controlled flame that propelled her like a comet. She landed amidst a group of panicked fire mages, her voice cutting through their confusion. Formation Delta. Now. Wide dispersion aim for area denial, not direct hits. To their credit, they listened. Something in her tone brooked no argument. Lyra took the stairs, her healing magic already weaving a protective cocoon around her. As she reached the courtyard, she saw the wounded, a first year with a gash in his leg, a teacher clutching a burned arm. She didn't stop to heal them individually. Instead, she placed her hands on the ancient stones of the summoning circle and reached. The ley lines responded like old friends. Green light erupted from the circle, spreading in a dome that covered half the courtyard. Within it, wounds began knitting themselves closed. Shadow creatures that tried to enter screamed as their forms unraveled into harmless mist. Elias and Kale took the back routes, through collapsed corridors and over rubble. Kale moved differently now. His steps were sure, his sword held in a guard position that felt instinctively right. He cut down two shadow creatures that ambushed them, his movements economical and deadly. You remember, Elias said as they ran. Fragments, Kale admitted. Like dreams. A battle on a bridge. You were on a throne of black crystal. We were kneeling. The Bridge of Sighs, Elias said. You held it for 3 days against the Silver Legion. Bought me time to complete the ritual of unmaking. Why? Kael asked. Why did we follow you? You were a demon king. A monster. Elias didn't answer immediately. They rounded a corner and found 3 of Malakar's lieutenants waiting, humanoid figures in dark armor, their faces hidden behind horned helms. They carried weapons that hummed with stolen magic. I offered you purpose, Elias said softly. In a world of gods and tyrants, I offered you freedom to be what you were meant to be. Not servants. Not heroes. Yourselves. The lead lieutenant stepped forward. Little king, it rasped, its voice like grinding stone. How you've fallen. This weak flesh, it suits you. Kael moved to engage, but Elias put a hand on his arm. Wait. He stepped forward alone, his student robes torn and dusty. To the lieutenants, he must have looked pathetic, a boy with no magical aura, no weapon, no hope. But Elias stood straight, and when he spoke, his voice changed. It deepened, layered with echoes of power that shouldn't have been possible. Malakar sends his dogs to do his work, Elias said. How typical. He always lacked courage. The lieutenants hesitated. There was something in that voice, a resonance that stirred ancient fears. You remember my law, Elias continued, taking another step. Any who raise arms against their king suffer the 1,000 cuts. Their souls rend. Their memories burned. An eternity of knowing what they lost. One of the lieutenants actually stepped back. It can't be, he died. We saw him fall. You saw what I allowed you to see, Elias said. He raised a hand, not in a spellcasting gesture, but in a simple, imperious motion. Kneel. And they did. Not all at once. The lead lieutenant resisted, his weapon shaking. But the other 2 dropped immediately, their armor clattering against stone. The compulsion wasn't magical, not in any sense the Academy would recognize. It was something deeper. A hierarchy written into the fabric of their beings. Kael watched, his sword half raised, his mind reeling. This wasn't magic. This was authority. Pure and absolute. The resistant lieutenant finally collapsed to one knee, his head bowed. My king. Where is Malakar? Elias asked. The Central Plaza. He completes the ritual as we speak. Elias nodded. Rise. Return to the shadows. Tell Malakar I'm coming. The lieutenants vanished into swirls of darkness, leaving Elias and Kael alone in the corridor. Kael stared at Elias, his expression unreadable. You let them go? They were never the threat, Elias said. Just distractions. Malakar wants me to waste time and energy fighting my way to him. To prove I'm still strong enough to be worth killing. He started moving again, faster now. Come on. The ritual is almost complete. They burst into the central plaza just as the last of the students were being forced onto the dark altar. The air thrummed with power, a sickening, hungry energy that made Kael's teeth ache. Above the altar floated Malakar. He looked nothing like the shadow creatures. He was tall, regal, clad in armor that seemed carved from midnight. His face was handsome in a sharp, cruel way, and his eyes glowed with familiar dark fire. When he saw Elias, he smiled. Zogaroth, Malakar's voice boomed across the plaza. Or should I call you Elias now? How quaint. The great demon king, reduced to a child playing at magic. Around them, the battle continued. Area's fire mages had formed a discipline line, their spells now coordinated and effective. Lyra's healing dome pulsed brightly, protecting dozens of wounded. The tide was turning, but here, at the ritual site, Malakar's power was concentrated and immense. Elias stepped forward, ignoring the terrified students, ignoring the teachers who stared in confusion. He met Malakar's gaze. You always did talk too much, Malakar, Elias said. His voice carried without shouting. It's why you failed as a general. All ambition, no patience. Malakar's smile vanished. I have patience enough. I waited 3,000 years for this moment. While you slept in your weak reincarnations, I preserved myself. I kept my power. My memories. He gestured at Elias's student robes. Look at you. A pathetic F rank. You can't even cast a proper fireball. I don't need to, Elias said. He glanced at Kale, then at Arya and Lyra, who had fought their way to the plaza's edge. His generals. His legacy. I have something better. Malakar laughed, a sound like breaking mountains. Your generals? These children? They don't remember you. They fear you. Look at their faces. He was right. Arya's expression was conflicted. Lyra's was fearful. Kale's hand tightened on his sword, his loyalty torn between the king he'd just remembered and the monster that king had been. They'll learn, Elias said. And for the first time, he allowed a flicker of his true power to show, not in spellwork, but in presence. The air around him grew heavy. Shadows deepened. Students nearby gasped and stumbled back, not from fear, but from sheer pressure. Just as you'll remember why you knelt to me. Malakar's eyes narrowed. The ritual beneath him pulsed, almost complete. The captured students cried out as dark energy began to drain from them. I kneel to no one, Malakar snarled. Not anymore. This era is mine. This world is mine. And I'll start by erasing the last remnant of a failed king. He raised his hands, and the sky darkened. The chapter ended with Malakar gathering apocalyptic power, his form swelling with stolen energy, while Elias stood alone before him, a boy in torn robes facing a god of shadow, his generals watching from the edges of the plaza, their decision yet unmade. The central plaza of Arcane Academy had become a stage for apocalypse. Malakar stood at its heart, dark energy swirling around him like a vortex of shattered night. His form, tall, armored in obsidian plates that seemed to drink the moonlight, was a grotesque parody of the generals Elias once commanded. Behind him, the sacrificial ritual pulsed with crimson light, tendrils of magic snaking toward the academy's main tower where students huddled in terror. Elias faced him, his own body a stark contrast, slender, clad in the simple gray uniform of an F-rank student, already bruised from earlier skirmishes. He could feel the strain in his muscles, the shallow breath in his lungs. This vessel was so fragile compared to the titanic form he'd once worn as Zogaroth. Yet his mind was a fortress. The legacy of Annihilation hummed within him, a library of millennia, every battle tactic, every arcane weakness, every fatal flaw Malakar had ever shown. Look at you, Malakar's voice boomed, dripping with contempt. A worm in borrowed skin. The great demon king, brought so low he must hide among children. Elias didn't respond. His eyes scanned the plaza, cracked cobblestones, shattered statues of past heroes, the distant forms of Arya, Kale, and Lyra watching from a defensive perimeter they'd hastily erected. He saw the conflict in their postures, Arya's flames flickering uncertainly, Kale's sword half-raised as if torn between targets, Lyra's healing blow tinged with anxiety. They were his generals, yet strangers. And Malakar knew it. You think they'll save you? Malakar laughed, a sound like grinding stone. They don't remember you, Zogaroth. I do. I kept my memories when you lost yours. I've spent decades gathering power while you played at being human. He raised a hand, and the dark energy coalesced into a spear of pure shadow. This ends now. I'll take your legacy and finish what you started. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm, almost conversational. You always were impatient, Malakar. Even when you betrayed me, you rushed the coup. Left flank exposed during the siege of Blackreach, remember? Malakar's eyes narrowed. Ancient history. Is it? Elias took a step forward, his movements deliberate. You're doing it again. That ritual, you're drawing power from the ley lines, but you've misaligned the third sigil. Too eager. It's leaking energy. A flicker of doubt crossed Malakar's face. Elias pressed on, tapping into the legacy. He didn't need brute strength, he needed precision. And your stance. You're favoring your right side. Old injury from when I broke your arm during training? You never fully healed it. Enough. Malachar hurled the shadow spear. Elias didn't dodge. He calculated its trajectory a fraction slow, angled slightly upward, and pivoted at the last moment, letting it graze his shoulder. Pain seared through him, but he used the momentum to close the distance. His hand shot out, fingers striking a precise point on Malachar's armored knee. A weak spot, one he'd designed himself millennia ago for his general's armor. Malachar staggered, surprise flashing in his eyes. How? You think I forgot? Elias's voice was a whisper only Malachar could hear. I built your armor. I know every flaw. He struck again, this time at the joint between breastplate and pauldron. His fist, weak as it was, found the tiny gap. Malachar grunted, dark energy flaring as he backhanded Elias across the plaza. Elias hit the ground hard, skidding across broken stone. Blood filled his mouth. He pushed himself up, vision swimming. Across the way, he saw Arya take a step forward, her flames brightening, but Kale held her back, his expression torn. See? Malachar boomed, advancing. Your body is nothing. You can't win with tricks alone. Elias knew he was right. The legacy gave him knowledge, but his physical form was failing. Each movement was agony, each breath felt like glass in his lungs. Malachar, with his retained power, was too strong. The ritual behind him glowed brighter, soon it would reach critical mass, and the academy would be consumed. He had one choice. Elias closed his eyes. Deep within, buried beneath layers of reincarnation and weakness, was a fragment of what he once was, the demonic energy of Zogaroth. He'd kept it locked away, fearing what its release might do to him, to others, to this fragile world he was trying to protect. But now? Giving up? Malachar taunted, gathering another spear of shadow. No, Elias whispered. Remembering. He reached inward, not with magic, but with will. The legacy of Annihilation wasn't just knowledge, it was a bridge to his past self. He touched that slumbering power, a dark, roaring river of energy that tasted of ash and eternity. It resisted at first, alien in this human body. Then it recognized him. The change was instantaneous. Elias's veins lit up with violet light, visible through his skin. Dark energy erupted from him in a wave, not chaotic like Malachar's, but controlled a precise, terrible pressure that made the very air shudder. His wounds knit themselves shut, his posture straightened. For a moment, he wasn't Elias the student, but Zogaroth the king, his presence filling the plaza. Malachar froze, his confidence cracking. You can't. Your body should reject it. It does, Elias said, his voice now layered with echoes. But I don't need it for long. He moved. No longer struggling, but flowing, a blur of motion that defied his earlier limitations. He didn't strike Malachar's armor this time, he struck the ritual's core sigils, his fingers trailing dark energy that unraveled the spellwork with surgical precision. The crimson light flickered, dimmed. No! Malachar roared, lunging. Their duel became a storm of shadows. Malachar fought with brute force, each blow shaking the ground. Elias fought with millennia of experience, parrying, redirecting, exploiting every opening. He saw Malachar's patterns, the same tells from 1,000 battles past. When Malachar overextended, Elias was there, driving a palm strike into his chest that shattered the obsidian armor. Malachar stumbled back, coughing black ichor. You're still weak. This power will burn you out. I know, Elias said, feeling the strain already, his body screaming in protest, the demonic energy eating at his life force. He had minutes at most. He didn't waste them. Gathering the dark energy into his hands, he shaped it not into a weapon, but into a binding, a lattice of pure will, based on a containment spell he'd used on rebellious demons eons ago. It settled over Malachar, pinning him to the ground. This is for the academy, Elias said, his voice beginning to fray. And for the generals you corrupted. With a final effort, he channeled the energy inward, collapsing the binding. Malachar screamed a sound of rage and despair as his form dissolved into shadows, then nothingness. The ritual died with him, its light snuffing out. Silence fell. Then Elias felt it, the demonic energy, no longer needed, surging out of control. It erupted from him in a pillar of violet light that tore into the sky, visible for miles. The ground cracked beneath his feet, the air hummed with ancient power. He tried to rein it in, but his body was breaking, veins blackening, eyes glowing with unnatural fire. He fell to his knees, the energy slowly fading, leaving him exhausted, human again, but changed. His skin was pale, traced with faint violet scars. And the aura, the unmistakable mark of demonic power, lingered around him like a shroud. He looked up. The entire academy was watching. Students peered from windows, teachers stood frozen in the ruins. And at the forefront, Headmaster Valerius, his expression unreadable, and Arya, Kale, and Lyra, their faces a mosaic of shock, fear, and dawning realization. No one spoke. The battle was over, but a new one had just begun in their eyes. Elias saw the truth dawning. The F-rank trash, the secret mentor, the tactical genius, he was something else entirely. And he was glowing with the dark energy of a demon king. Valerius took a step forward, his staff raised not in attack, but in wary recognition. Elias. But Elias couldn't answer. The last of his strength gone, he collapsed onto the cold stone, the world fading to black as their stares burned into him. Silence fell over the academy plaza like a physical weight. The air still crackled with residual energy, the sharp ozone of shattered magic, the acrid scent of burnt stone, and beneath it all, the faint, unmistakable tang of demonic power. Elias lay on his back, chest heaving, the glow around him slowly fading from violent crimson to a dull, pulsing amber. Every muscle screamed in protest. Tapping into even a fragment of his old strength had felt like tearing his soul apart. Around him, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Malachar's defeated form lay 20 feet away, unconscious and bound by shimmering restraints Headmaster Valerius had hastily conjured. The traitor general's forces, a mix of shadowy constructs and a few renegade mages, had scattered or surrendered the moment their leader fell. But no one was paying them any attention. All eyes were fixed on Elias. He pushed himself up on trembling elbows, his vision swimming. The plaza, usually pristine with its white marble and glowing mana lamps, was scarred with deep fissures and blackened patches where Malachar's dark magic had struck. Students and teachers stood in frozen clusters, their expressions a tapestry of shock, fear, and dawning horror. He could see it in their faces, the moment of realization. That surge of energy hadn't been some hidden talent or forbidden spell. It was something ancient, something fundamentally wrong. Elias? The voice was soft, tentative. Arya stood at the edge of the clearing, her fiery hair matted with sweat and dust. Flames still licked at her fingertips, a nervous habit she'd developed during training. Behind her, Kale had his sword half-drawn, knuckles white on the hilt. Lyra was kneeling beside a wounded student, her healing magic a soft gold, but her eyes were locked on Elias, wide and unblinking. He met her gaze, and for a second, he saw it, the flicker of memory. Not full recollection, but the ghost of it. The same look she'd given him millennia ago, in the throne room of his dark castle, when he'd ordered her to heal a fallen comrade. Loyalty warring with fear. Headmaster Valerius stepped forward, his robes billowing despite the still air. The old man's face was grim, etched with lines of exhaustion and something else, resignation? He raised a hand, and a sphere of silencing magic expanded outward, muffling the rising whispers from the crowd. Everyone, remain calm, Valerius said, his voice carrying with amplified clarity. The immediate threat is neutralized. Medical teams, attend to the wounded. Guards, secure the prisoners. His orders were crisp, efficient, but his eyes never left Elias. After a moment, he gestured. Arya, Kale, Lyra, with me. And bring him. Kale's grip tightened on his sword. Headmaster, he just. I know what he just did, Valerius cut him off, tone brooking no argument. Now. Arya moved first, striding over to Elias and offering a hand. Her touch was warm, almost scorching, but her fingers trembled slightly. Elias took it, letting her haul him to his feet. His legs nearly buckled, and she steadied him, her expression unreadable. "Can you walk?" she murmured. "I have to," Elias replied, his voice hoarse. They formed a loose procession, Valerius leading, Elias flanked by the 3 generals, a dozen academy guards falling in behind. The crowd parted silently, stares boring into Elias's back. He kept his head high, ignoring the way some students flinched as he passed. He'd faced worse than their judgment. He'd faced armies, gods, his own mortality. But this quiet, terrified condemnation somehow felt sharper. They didn't go to Valerius's office. Instead, they entered the Grand Hall, a vast chamber normally reserved for ceremonies and council meetings. It was empty now, save for a long oak table at the far end, where 5 figures already sat. The Academy Council. Elias recognized them from his time skulking in the library, studying this new world's power structures. Counselor Thorn, a stern-faced woman with ice-blue hair and a reputation for zero tolerance toward dark magic. Counselor Bram, an elderly earth mage who'd written half the textbooks on defensive wards. Counselor Celine, an illusionist with eyes that saw too much. And 2 others, veteran teachers whose names escaped him. Their expressions ranged from wary to openly hostile. Valerius took his seat at the head of the table, gesturing for Elias to stand before them. Arya, Kale, and Lyra positioned themselves slightly behind him, a silent, tense barrier between him and the guards. "Headmaster," Counselor Thorn began, her voice like cracking ice. "Explain. Now." Valerius steepled his fingers. "This student, Elias, has just defeated Malachar, a remnant of the ancient demon empire, and prevented a ritual that would have leveled the academy. In doing so, he utilized power that aligns with historical records of Zogaroth, the Demon King." A ripple went through the council. Bram's hands clenched on the table. Celine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as if trying to peel back layers of illusion from Elias's face. "Are you claiming," Thorn said slowly, "that this boy is Zogaroth? The Destroyer? The one who nearly unmade the world?" "I am claiming he is the reincarnation of that entity," Valerius corrected. "His soul carries the legacy of Annihilation, the memories, knowledge, and potential of the Demon King. But he is not the same being that wrought havoc millennia ago." Semantics. Bram slammed a fist on the table. "He has demonic energy. We all felt it. Saw it. That glow." Elias took a shallow breath. His body still ached, but his mind was clearing, falling into the cold, analytical patterns of strategy. This was a tribunal. His life and possibly the future of his generals hung in the balance. "It's true," he said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. All eyes snapped to him. He didn't flinch. "I am Zogaroth. Or rather, I was. I died defeated, sealed away, and woke up in this body, in this time. I don't know how or why. But I remember everything. The wars, the magic, the mistakes." Lyra made a small, choked sound behind him. He could feel Kale's glare like a physical pressure. "And you hid this," Celine said, not a question. "Would you have welcomed me with open arms?" Elias asked, a bitter smile touching his lips. "An F-rank student, suddenly claiming to be a reborn tyrant? I'd have been executed or dissected within the hour." "You still might be," Thorn said coldly. "The risk you pose is incalculable. That power, even a fragment of it, could corrupt everything it touches." "He saved us." The words came from Arya, sharp and clear. She stepped forward, standing beside Elias, her chin lifted defiantly. "Malachar would have killed everyone." The teachers were overwhelmed. "We were overwhelmed." Elias stopped him. "He's been training us, teaching us things that actually work, not the flawed techniques we learned here." Kale shifted, his sword finally sliding back into its sheath with a soft click. "She's right. I didn't want to believe it. But, the things he knows. The way he fights. It's not just book learning. It's experience. Centuries of it. Lyra nodded slowly, her healing magic still glowing faintly around her hands. And he hasn't hurt anyone. Not unless they attacked first. Even now, he's tired. Not threatening. Not yet, Bram muttered. Valerius held up a hand. Elias. Why? Why help the academy? Why train these students? If you are truly Zogaroth, we are your enemies. The descendants of those who defeated you. Elias looked at Arya, Kale, Lyra. Their faces were tense, confused, but there was no hatred there. Not anymore. Just a desperate need to understand. Because they're mine, he said softly. Not as possessions. As comrades. In my past life, they were my generals. My most loyal. They fought and died for a cause I now see was misguided. They've been reborn too, weakened, their memories gone. But their souls are still the same. I couldn't stand by and watch them be led astray by teachings that would get them killed. Or worse, watch them fall to something like Malachar. He turned back to the council. I don't want to conquer this world. I've had my fill of empires. I just want redemption. A chance to use what I know to protect, not destroy. But I understand if you can't trust that. So I'll leave. Tonight. You'll never see me again. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Counselor Celine was studying him, her illusionist senses probing. You're sincere, she said, sounding almost surprised. Or you believe you are. But intentions can change. Power corrupts. It can, Elias agreed. But it doesn't have to. Let me go. The threat is over. Malachar is captured. Your academy is safe. Thorn shook her head. And if you change your mind? If you decide to rebuild your empire elsewhere? We'd be unleashing a demon king upon the world with a head start. Then execute me. The words hung in the air, stark and simple. Elias spread his hands, palms up. If you truly believe I'm too dangerous to live, do it. I won't resist. But ask yourselves, did I act like a monster today? Or did I act like a soldier trying to save his home? Valerius closed his eyes, weariness settling deep into his features. When he opened them, he looked at each counselor in turn. We are educators. We believe in second chances. In growth. Elias has saved hundreds of lives today. He has cooperated, trained our students, and shown restraint. I move we grant him exile. Under monitoring, if necessary. But not death. A long, tense vote followed. Bram and Thorn were firmly for execution. Celine and the two other teachers sided with Valerius. In the end, it was 3-2 for exile. You will leave the academy grounds within the hour, Thorn said, her voice tight with disapproval. You will be tracked by a scrying spell for 1 year. If you use demonic magic on a large scale, we will know, and we will come for you. Do you understand? Elias nodded. Thank you. He turned to go, his steps slow, heavy. The weight of the decision settled on him, not relief, but a hollow acceptance. He'd hoped, perhaps foolishly, for more. For a place. But this was the best he could expect. Elias, wait. Arya's voice stopped him at the doors. He looked back. She was standing with Kale and Lyra, their expressions resolved. We're coming with you, Arya said. Elias blinked. What? Kale folded his arms. You heard her. This place, it's not our home anymore. Not after today. We have questions. About who we were. Who we are. And you're the only one with answers. Lyra offered a small, hesitant smile. And you're still terrible at healing magic. Someone needs to patch you up when you do something stupid. Elias stared at them, a strange warmth spreading through his chest, melting some of the ice that had formed there. You'd follow me? Knowing what I am? Not as subjects, Arya said firmly. As allies. Equals. We're not your generals anymore. We're friends. Or we can be. For the first time since awakening in this week, mocked body, Elias felt a genuine smile touch his lips. It was small, weary, but real. Alright then. Let's go. He pushed open the doors, stepping out into the twilight. The academy sprawled before him, wounded but standing. Behind him, 3 figures fell into step: a fire mage, a swordsman, a healer, each carrying echoes of a past they were only beginning to remember. Elias didn't look back. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the ghosts of his legacy. But for the first time, he wasn't walking it alone. And that, he thought as the cool evening air brushed his face, was a beginning worth fighting for.